Hello story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. I work the late shift at a small diner off Route 12. It's the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, tucked between a gas station that closes at 8 and a rundown hardware store that's been out of business for years. The diner has been my second home for nearly 3 years now. I'm the guy who flips the sign to closed every night, scrubs the counters until they shine, and locks the door behind me as the last neon glow of the open 24-hour sign fizzles out. It's a quiet life, predictable even, and that's exactly how I like it. My routine was the kind of thing you could set your watch to. Clock in at 8, chat with the regulars until they headed home, clean up, restock, and head out by 3 in the morning. Most nights, the hum of the coffee machine and the occasional crackle of an old jukebox were the only sounds keeping me company. My name is Tom, by the way. I've always been a night owl, so the graveyard shift didn't bother me. In fact, I preferred it. Fewer people, fewer headaches. My coworkers were the daytime crew, always bright, chirpy, and full of energy. The late shift? That was mine alone. It was just me, the diner, and the occasional trucker stopping in for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. The diner itself had a charm about it, like it had been frozen in time. Vinyl booths with stuffing peeking out at the seams, black and white checkered floors that squeak no matter how much you clean them, and a counter lined with faded swivel stools. The smell of frying bacon and brewed coffee clung to the walls. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. I'd grown to know every inch of the place. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead. I could tell when the toaster oven was about to give out, or when the old freezer in the back needed a kick to start humming again. It was comforting in a way, knowing the diner as well as I did. My nights were uneventful for the most part. I'd start by prepping the coffee station, ensuring there was always a fresh pot for anyone who wandered in. Then I'd take stock of supplies, jotting down what needed refilling or replacing. Around midnight, I'd sweep and mop, leaving the place spotless for the morning crew. It was a cycle, the same thing every night. But the best part of the job was the view from the counter. Through the diner's wide windows, I could see the world at its quietest. The highway stretched out in both directions, the occasional headlights cutting through the darkness. A lone street lamp cast its light over the parking lot, illuminating a scattering of fallen leaves. The diner's neon sign reflected faintly in the glass, creating a soft red glow that seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. There was something peaceful about those hours. The world felt still, like it was holding its breath. And for the longest time, I thought that stillness was my friend. I like to think of myself as observant. I noticed things most people wouldn't. The way a regular folded his napkin the same way every night, or how the clock in the corner always ran 3 minutes fast. It was a skill that came with working alone, I suppose. And in a place like this, where not much happened, you paid attention to the little things. But lately, the little things had started to bother me. At first, it was subtle. Too subtle to mention to anyone without sounding crazy. The salt shaker on table 3 would be slightly out of place, or the napkin dispenser by the window would be half empty when I could have sworn I filled it earlier. It wasn't enough to alarm me, just enough to make me pause. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I'd been careless or distracted. One night, I found a coffee cup on the counter by the register. It was empty, but the faint ring of black coffee at the bottom told me it had been used. I hadn't poured any coffee for hours, and I knew I hadn't left the cup there. I shook it off, chalking it up to forgetfulness. Maybe I'd placed it there earlier and just didn't remember. Then there was the jukebox. That old thing had been out of order for as long as I'd worked here. It sat in the corner, gathering dust and serving more as decoration than anything else. But one night, just as I was about to lock up, I heard a faint hum. At first, I thought it was coming from the freezer in the back, but when I stepped closer, I realized it was the jukebox. The hum turned into a low, crackling sound, like static on a radio. It only lasted a few seconds before stopping altogether. I stared at the machine, half expecting it to start playing a song, but it stayed silent. I shook my head and laughed at myself, brushing it off as another quirk of the diner's aging equipment. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to those little things. But at the time, I didn't think much of them. After all, it was just the diner being the diner, old, creaky, and full of surprises. What I didn't realize was that those little surprises were just the beginning. For weeks, I brushed off those small occurrences, the salt shaker out of place, the used coffee cup, and the jukebox's strange hum. They felt too insignificant to dwell on, and life went on as usual. But one particular night, something happened that I couldn't explain away so easily. It was a Thursday, one of the quieter nights. I had just finished wiping down the tables and was in the process of refilling the ketchup bottles. The diner was empty, as it often was after midnight, and the silence wrapped around me like a blanket. Outside, the highway was deserted, and the street lamp cast its usual halo of light over the parking lot. As I worked, I thought I heard the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I dismissed it as the creak of the old floorboards under my own weight. But then it came again, a distinct, deliberate shuffle. This time, it sounded like it was coming from the far end of the diner, near the back booths. I froze, the ketchup bottle in my hand mid-pour. My eyes flicked to the corner of the room, where the booths were cast in shadows. The dim light from the neon sign wasn't enough to fully illuminate that part of the diner, but I could swear I saw movement. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steady but laced with unease. No response. Setting the ketchup bottle down, I grabbed the small flashlight we kept under the counter for power outages and walked toward the booths. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one sounding louder than the last. When I reached the corner booth, I shone the flashlight over the table and seats. Nothing. The floor was spotless, the table was clean, and the booth was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and shook my head. Maybe I was just tired. Working nights had a way of messing with your mind, making you hear things that weren't there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back to the counter and continued with my tasks, trying to distract myself. But the diner felt different now, like the air was heavier somehow. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed amplified. Around 1:30 a.m., I decided to take a short break. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the counter, my eyes scanning the room. The diner was quiet, as it should have been, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was irrational, I knew that, but the sensation was so strong that I kept glancing over my shoulder. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch my attention. My head snapped toward the window by the entrance, but there was nothing there. Just the reflection of the diner's interior in the glass. I stood up, coffee forgotten, and walked to the window. Pressing my face close to the glass, I peered outside. The parking lot was empty, and the only movement was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. But as I turned to walk away, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the window, a faint smudge, like a handprint. I leaned closer, my breath fogging up the glass. The smudge was faint, but unmistakable. It was the outline of a hand, the fingers long and slender, pressed against the outside of the glass. A chill ran down my spine. I opened the diner's door and stepped out into the cool night air. The parking lot was silent, the asphalt glistening faintly under the street lamp. I walked around to the window where the handprint had been, but the glass was clean. No smudge, no sign that anything had been there. Rubbing my arms against the chill, I went back inside and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been my own handprint from earlier, distorted by the light. Or maybe it was just condensation on the glass. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, The feeling of being watched lingered. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of that handprint. It was such a small thing, really, but it gnawed at the edges of my mind. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see those long fingers pressed against the glass again. When my shift ended, I locked up the diner and practically ran to my car. As I drove home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, my paranoia getting the better of me. But the road behind me was empty, just as it should have been. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing more than my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had left that handprint wasn't done with me yet. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the smudge on the window in the shadowy corner of the diner where I thought I'd seen movement. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted but no closer to understanding what had happened. The next evening, when I returned to the diner, I felt a strange mix of dread and determination. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, to chalk it up to fatigue or an overactive imagination. But another part of me, the part that had noticed the subtle changes over the past few weeks, wanted answers. I spent the first few hours of my shift on edge, jumping at every small sound. But as the night wore on, I began to relax. The diner seemed normal again, its familiar creaks and hums a comforting background noise. Around midnight, as I was restocking the shelves in the storage room, I heard a faint sound coming from the front of the diner. It wasn't footsteps this time, but something softer, like the rustling of fabric. I stopped what I was doing and listened, my heart racing. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight and walked cautiously toward the counter. The diner was empty, just as I'd left it. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The salt shaker on table 3 was tipped over, spilling salt onto the table. I stared at it, my mind racing. I hadn't touched that table since the start of my shift, and no one else had been in the diner. I walked over, righted the shaker, and wiped up the spilled salt with a napkin. As I turned to throw the napkin away, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. On the counter, where I had been sitting earlier, was a coffee cup. It was empty, but a faint ring of black coffee stained the bottom. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't poured myself coffee that night. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the cup. Then I grabbed it and walked to the sink, rinsing it out with trembling hands. I told myself it was a coincidence, that maybe I'd forgotten pouring the coffee. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was happening in the diner, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The handprint, the footsteps, the overturned salt shaker, and the mysteriously appearing coffee cup were just the beginning. As the nights passed, the occurrences grew bolder, as though whatever was behind them wanted to make itself known. It began subtly. Items in the diner were out of place more frequently. The ketchup bottles I had refilled the night before would be half empty when I arrived for my next shift. Shares that were neatly pushed in after closing would be slightly askew. These could have easily been mistakes or overlooked details, but I wasn't so sure anymore. One night, I came in to find the jukebox playing a low, mournful tune. That wasn't unusual. The jukebox had a tendency to turn itself on from time to time. But this time was different. The song it wasn't on the jukebox's playlist. At least, not one I recognized. It was slow and haunting, the kind of melody that sticks to the back of your mind and makes the hair on your arms stand on end. I walked over to the jukebox, my sneakers squeaking against the spotless tile floor, and unplugged it. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. But even after I walked away, I could swear I still heard faint notes echoing in the air, like a memory that refused to fade. As the strange events became more frequent, my anxiety grew. I started paying closer attention to the little things, trying to catch whatever or whoever was responsible. I checked the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a night, making sure nothing was left unsecured. I even began leaving my phone recording audio while I worked, hoping to catch a clue. What I captured wasn't what I had expected. On one particular night, I set my phone on the counter while cleaning up and let it record. The diner was empty except for me, and for most of the recording, the audio was uneventful. Just the sound of my footsteps, the clink of dishes, and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. But when I reviewed the recording later that night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Amidst the mundane sounds of the diner, there was a faint whisper. It was low, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. It didn't sound like words, at least none that I could understand. It was more like a breathy murmur, the kind of sound someone makes when they're standing just behind you. I listened to the recording over and over, trying to make sense of it. I even tried amplifying the audio, but the whisper remained unintelligible. Still, it was enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. I wasn't alone in the diner at night. Determined to find answers, I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence in detail. I wrote down the times, the dates, and what I had noticed. I thought that maybe, if I kept track, I could find a pattern or a clue that would help me understand what was happening. But the more I documented, the more unsettling things became. One night, as I was jotting down notes in my journal, I felt a sudden chill. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel from a draft or an open window. This was different, sharp and bone deep, like stepping into a shadow. I glanced up from my notebook and saw the condensation on the window by the entrance. It was strange because the diner was warm, and there was no reason for the glass to fog up like that. But as I watched, the condensation began to move, as though something was tracing lines across the glass from the outside. I walked over, my heart pounding in my chest, and stared at the window. The lines formed slowly, deliberately, until they created a shape. It wasn't a word or a picture, but something abstract, a series of intersecting lines and curves that didn't make sense to me. I reached out and touched the glass, but it was warm, not cold. Whatever had made the marks wasn't on the outside. By this point, I was convinced there was something in the diner, something unseen but undeniably present. I started experimenting, leaving items in specific places to see if they'd be moved. One night, I placed a single fork in the middle of the counter and took a photo of it with my phone for reference. When I came back from the storeroom half an hour later, the fork was gone. I searched the diner from top to bottom, checking every table, every chair, even the floor, but it was nowhere to be found. The photo on my phone was the only proof it had ever been there. The incidents weren't just confined to the diner anymore. I started noticing strange things at home too. My keys would disappear from the hook by the door, only to turn up in odd places like the freezer or the bathroom sink. Lights I was sure I had turned off would be on when I came home, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The worst was the knocking. It began sporadically, just a single knock here and there on the walls, the doors, even the windows. But over time, it became more frequent and more deliberate, as though someone or something was trying to get my attention. One night, as I was getting ready for work, I heard 3 loud knocks on my apartment door. I opened it immediately, expecting to see a neighbor or someone from the building, but the hallway was empty. I checked the security camera footage later that night. The hallway had been empty the entire time. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The lack of sleep, the constant unease, and the relentless occurrences were taking their toll. I started confiding in a coworker, one of the morning shift waitresses, hoping she might have some insight. She told me about an old rumor, something the locals whispered about, but never took seriously. Supposedly years ago, before the diner was built, the land had been the site of an accident. A young boy had gone missing near the area and was never found. Some said his spirit lingered, unable to rest. I didn't know if I believed in ghosts, but the story stuck with me. It was just plausible enough to make sense of the things I'd been experiencing. Determined to find answers, I started digging into the diner's history. I searched old newspapers, talked to longtime residents, and even visited the local library. The more I learned, the more unsettled I became. The land had a dark past. Before the diner, it had been a service station, and before that, a small house that burned down in the 1950s. The house had belonged to a family of 4, but only 3 bodies were recovered from the fire. The youngest child, a boy, was never accounted for. The records didn't provide much more information, but it was enough to deepen my unease. I started to wonder if whatever was happening in the diner was connected to the boy or to something even older. I began spending more time in the diner, hoping to catch something definitive. I brought a small handheld camera with me, setting it up in various corners of the room to record throughout my shifts. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't want to be the crazy guy chasing ghosts. The footage I captured was subtle but unnerving. In one clip, a napkin on the counter slowly slid across the surface as though pushed by an invisible hand. In another, the lights above table 3 flickered, though none of the other lights in the diner were affected. And in the most chilling clip of all, a shadow moved across the far wall, even though nothing in the room could have cast it. The more evidence I gathered, the more certain I became that something was trying to communicate with me. But what did it want? My journal was now filled with notes, sketches, and observations. I felt like a detective piecing together a puzzle, but the closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. It was as though whatever was in the diner didn't want to be understood. And as the events escalated, I began to fear that my search for answers might come at a cost I wasn't prepared to pay. The diner was eerily quiet that night, quieter than it had ever been. Even the usual hum of the appliances seemed muffled, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I could feel that something was building. The strange occurrences that had plagued me for weeks weren't just random anymore. They were leading to something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would bring answers, whether I was ready for them or not. It started innocently enough. I was restocking the sugar packets at the counter when the lights flickered. Not unusual, given the diner's aging electrical system. But this time, they didn't come back on right away. Instead, they dimmed to a faint glow, casting the room in an unsettling twilight. "Not again," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. I grabbed my flashlight from under the counter and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the dimness. As I moved toward the breaker box in the storeroom, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I shivered despite the sweater I was wearing. The cold wasn't natural, it was biting and unnatural, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the room entirely. I reached the storeroom door and hesitated. Something in me didn't want to open it. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the other side. Tap, tap, tap. Swallowing hard, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, illuminating shelves of canned goods and cleaning supplies. Everything was as it should be, except for one thing. The breaker box was wide open. The switches were in the correct positions, yet the lights in the diner remained dim. That's when I noticed the writing on the wall. In the beam of my flashlight, faint letters began to appear, as though being traced by an unseen hand. The words were jagged and uneven, written in a language I didn't understand. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and reached out to touch the wall. The surface was icy cold, and as my fingers brushed against it, the writing disappeared. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. This wasn't just a series of odd occurrences anymore. This was deliberate. Returning to the diner's main floor, I found that the dim light had taken on a reddish way. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening, even if it meant facing whatever had been tormenting me. That's when the jukebox came to life. It started playing that same haunting melody I'd heard weeks ago, the one that wasn't part of its playlist. But this time, the song was louder, echoing through the empty diner like a dirge. The sound seemed to vibrate in my chest, each note sending a shiver down my spine. I approached the jukebox cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I reached out to unplug it, the music stopped abruptly. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall, not cast by any light or object in the room. It was humanoid in shape, tall and thin, but it wasn't solid. It shifted and shimmered like smoke, its edges curling and twisting unnaturally. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't answer, but it began to move closer, its form growing darker and more defined. The air grew colder with each step it took, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I backed away, nearly tripping over one of the diner's chairs. My flashlight flickered, the beam weakening as the shadow loomed closer. I was frozen in place, unable to look away as it reached out a hand, if you could call it that. Its fingers were long and spindly, tapering to sharp points that seemed to pierce the air itself. Just as it was about to touch me, the lights in the diner blazed back to full brightness. The shadow recoiled, dissolving into wisps of smoke that vanished into the ceiling. I collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. But the ordeal wasn't over. The walls of the diner began to tremble, the vibrations rattling the dishes and silverware. The windows fogged over, and for a moment, I thought I could see faces in the condensation, twisted, anguished faces staring in from the darkness outside. Then, the voices started. They were faint at first, a low murmur that grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and blending together in a cacophony of whispers. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, sorrow, and desperation all mixed together. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating inside my head. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Just stop!" And then, as suddenly as it began, the noise ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. When I finally found the courage to stand, I noticed something on the counter. It was my journal, the one I'd been using to document all the strange occurrences. But it wasn't where I'd left it. The pages were open, and the writing inside wasn't mine. The once blank sections were now filled with the same jagged, unreadable script I'd seen in the storeroom. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. The writing grew more frantic and chaotic as I went, until the final page was nothing but a mass of scribbles. In the center of the chaos was a single word written in bold, slashing strokes. Love. That was all the confirmation I needed. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the diner, not bothering to lock up. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was a welcome relief after the oppressive atmosphere inside. As I stood in the parking lot, gasping for breath, I looked back at the diner. The windows were dark, and the building looked just as it always had. But I knew better. I didn't go back. The diner closed permanently a few weeks later, the owner citing unexplained damages and a lack of business. I never told anyone what happened that night, not even my coworkers. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that haunting melody in my dreams. And when I wake, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. I never returned to the diner after that night. I didn't even go back to collect my last paycheck or retrieve the belongings I had left behind. Whatever I'd encountered, there had been enough to strip me of any lingering curiosity. It wasn't just fear that kept me away. It was the undeniable feeling that I wasn't welcome anymore. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. The long hours, the isolation of the night shift, maybe even something in the food I'd been eating there, it all seemed like a plausible explanation. But deep down, I knew better. There were too many things that I couldn't explain, too many pieces that didn't fit together. The dreams started not long after. They were vivid, more real than anything I'd experienced while awake. I would find myself back in the diner, the lights dim and the air thick with that same unnatural cold. The jukebox would play its haunting melody, and the shadowy figure would loom in the corner, watching me. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence was suffocating. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as though I'd been running for miles. The worst part was that the dreams felt less like memories and more like warnings. I tried to move on with my life, taking a new job at a grocery store during the day shift. It was mundane and far from exciting, but it gave me a sense of normalcy that I desperately needed. I avoided talking about the diner, even when my coworkers brought it up in passing. The building had become something of an urban legend in town, with rumors swirling about its sudden closure and the strange events leading up to it. One day, curiosity got the better of me, and I did a bit of digging. I found out that the diner had been built on the site of an old farmhouse that had burned down decades ago. There were whispers of tragedies tied to the land disappearances, accidents, and a family that had reportedly vanished without a trace. But none of it was enough to explain what I had experienced. I thought about telling anyone about what had happened. A therapist, a priest, even the police. But every time I considered it, I stopped myself. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? How could I explain the things I'd seen without sounding like a fool? The journal, though, was a different story. I still had it, though I couldn't bring myself to look at it most days. It sat in a drawer in my bedroom, untouched and unread. I was too afraid of what I might find if I opened it again. But it felt like a tether to the experience, a reminder that it hadn't all been in my head. Months passed, and life began to settle into a routine. The dreams became less frequent, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd put the whole thing behind me. That belief shattered one cold November evening. I was walking home from the grocery store, the sun already set and the streets eerily quiet. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the air had that same biting chill I felt in the diner. I told myself it was just the weather, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. In the distance, standing under a flickering streetlight, was the shadowy figure. It was the same one I'd seen in the diner, its form shifting and curling like smoke. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze lock onto me. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The figure didn't advance, didn't make any threatening gestures. It just stood there, watching. Finally, my body broke free from its paralysis, and I turned and bolted. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my apartment, the door locked and bolted behind me. That night, I made a decision. I retrieved the journal from its drawer and sat down at the kitchen table, flipping through its pages for the first time in months. The strange, jagged writing was still there, but something was different. On the last page, beneath the word leave, a new message had appeared. It read, "It's not over." My hands shook as I closed the journal and shoved it back into the drawer. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. In the days that followed, I started noticing strange things again. Lights flickering in my apartment, cold spots that seemed to follow me from room to room, and that same haunting melody playing faintly in the back of my mind. I knew then that whatever had been in the diner hadn't stayed there. It had followed me, and it wasn't going to let go. I reached out to an old friend who was into paranormal investigations, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who I knew wouldn't dismiss me as crazy. When I told him my story, his expression grew serious, and he agreed to come over and take a look at the journal. When he arrived, we sat down together, and I handed him the book. As he flipped through its pages, his face grew pale. "This isn't just random scribbling," he said, his voice low. "These symbols, they're ancient. I don't know exactly what they mean, but they're not good." He suggested burning the journal, believing it might sever whatever connection I had to the entity. Desperate, I agreed. That night, we built a fire in my backyard and tossed the journal into the flames. As it burned, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But that relief was short-lived. The dreams came back with a vengeance, more vivid and terrifying than ever. The figure wasn't just watching me anymore, it was reaching for me, its spindly fingers wrapping around my throat as I struggled to breathe. I woke up gasping, my chest heaving and my heart racing. The air in my bedroom was cold, and the faint smell of smoke lingered, as though the journal hadn't been destroyed after all. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by objects or places. It was bound to me. I still don't know what it wants or why it chose me. But one thing is clear. This is far from over. The diner may have been the beginning, but it wasn't the end. And as much as I want to believe I can escape, I know that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. It's been nearly a year since that night in the diner, but in many ways, it feels like it just happened. The memories are still raw, like a wound that refuses to heal. Every so often, I find myself replaying those events, trying to make sense of what I saw, what I felt, and why it happened to me. But there are no answers, just an endless loop of questions. Life goes on, of course. I still wake up each morning, go to work, and pretend everything is fine. To an outsider, I look like anyone else, a regular guy getting by in the world. But inside, there's a constant undercurrent of dread, a gnawing fear that never really goes away. The dreams still haunt me, though not as frequently as they once did. When they come, they're as vivid and horrifying as ever. I see the shadowy figure, always just out of reach, but impossibly close at the same time. I hear the eerie melody from the jukebox, the notes worming their way into my mind like an unwelcome guest. And I feel the cold and unnatural, bone-deep chill that no amount of blankets can shake. I've learned to cope in small ways. I keep the lights on in my apartment at night, though it doesn't always help. I avoid places that feel too quiet or too empty, and I carry a small charm a friend gave me, something she claimed would offer protection. I don't know if it works, but holding it makes me feel just a little less helpless. Sometimes, I wonder if I should leave this town altogether, start fresh somewhere far away. Maybe whatever this thing is wouldn't follow me. But deep down, I know it wouldn't matter. Whatever I encountered that night isn't tied to a place. It's tied to me. I've tried to find others who might have experienced something similar. I've scoured online forums, read books on the paranormal, even reached out to a few self-proclaimed experts. Most of what I find is vague, contradictory, or outright nonsensical. But occasionally, I come across a story that feels familiar. A fleeting mention of shadowy figures, of strange melodies, of cold that feels alive. It's a strange kind of comfort, knowing I'm not alone. But it's also terrifying. Because if others have faced this, and they haven't found a way to stop it, what chance do I have? The most unsettling part is the realization that it doesn't seem to want to harm me, not directly, at least. It could have done so 100 times over by now. No, whatever this is, it's something worse than malicious. It's patient, and that's what keeps me up at night. Not the dreams, not the cold, not even the shadowy figure. It's the waiting, the not knowing when or if it will finally make its move. I've stopped trying to explain it to people. Those who know me well can tell something's changed, but they don't press me for details. I think they're afraid of what they might hear. And honestly, I don't blame them. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that some questions are better left unanswered. Every so often, I drive past the diner. It's still there, though the windows are boarded up and the parking lot is overgrown with weeds. Nobody's touched it since the night I left. It's as if the town itself has decided to forget it ever existed. But I can't forget. I've thought about going back, just once, to see if I can find any closure. But the idea fills me with a paralyzing fear. What if it's still there, waiting for me? Or worse, what if it's not there, because it's already moved on to somewhere or someone else? So I keep driving. Past the diner, past the memories, past the questions I'll never answer. And yet, even as I try to move forward, a part of me knows that I'll never really escape it. Whatever this thing is, it's become a part of me now. A shadow that will follow me for the rest of my life. I don't know how this story ends, or if it ever truly will. Maybe one day, I'll wake up and find the cold is gone, the dreams have stopped, and the figure is no longer watching. Or maybe I'll spend the rest of my life waiting for the moment it decides to reveal its purpose. All I know is this: I've changed. The person I was before that night is gone, replaced by someone who knows that the world is darker and stranger than we care to admit. So, if you're ever working the late shift, alone in a place that feels just a little too quiet, a little too still, pay attention. Listen to the sounds around you. Watch for the things that move just out of sight. And if you feel the cold creeping in, no matter how warm it should be, leave. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I've been working as a call center agent for a little over 2 years now. It's the kind of job where the days blend together. The repetitive tasks and endless scripts can make time feel like it's crawling, but there's something oddly comforting about the predictability of it all. My shift usually starts at 7 p.m., and I sit at my desk in a small, dimly lit room at the back of a large building that houses dozens of other agents. We all work under the hum of fluorescent lights, tapping away at keyboards and speaking into headsets. It's quiet, almost too quiet, with the occasional murmur of someone on a call or the faint sound of phones ringing in the distance. The building is old, not exactly modern, but it's been well maintained over the years. I'm not alone in this story, of course. There are other agents who work alongside me, but they're not the ones you'll hear much about. The focus here is on me because, well, this is my experience. I wasn't expecting anything to change on that particular evening, and honestly, it was the same as any other night. I got to work, clocked in, and settled into my chair, adjusting the headset that had become second nature to me by now. The sound of my fingers on the keyboard was the only thing breaking the silence in the office. No one else was around at that time. The usual crowd of agents had already gone home, leaving only a few of us behind to take calls through the night. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills. I'd never been one for big social gatherings or exciting nights out, so this job suited me well. The calls, when they came in, were the usual mix of customer inquiries, tech support, and the occasional complaint. People often got frustrated, but I had learned to handle it all with ease. After all, it was my job to make sure each call ended on a positive note. Little did I know that tonight, I would encounter something that would haunt me for much longer than I could have ever imagined. There was nothing particularly special about the building itself. It was a commercial space tucked away in a quiet part of town, surrounded by old brick buildings and a few fast food restaurants. The area was known for being safe, with minimal foot traffic after sunset. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But, like most stories of this nature, it's not the location that matters. It's the things that lurk beneath the surface, the things that can't be explained, that make an otherwise ordinary place unforgettable. As I settled into my routine that night, I could hear the faint chatter of the few other agents still working. They were in the next room, but the walls were thin, and their voices drifted in occasionally. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, the usual scent of a busy office. My desk was cluttered with sticky notes, an empty coffee cup, and a few half-completed reports. I remember feeling a bit off that evening, but it was nothing I could put my finger on. It was just one of those moments when you feel like something isn't quite right, but you can't identify the cause. And that's how the night began uneventfully, with just the hum of the air conditioning and the faint noise of other agents working. I didn't know it then, but that strange sense of unease would soon give way to something far more sinister. The night continued as usual for a while. I settled into the rhythm of the calls, each one flowing into the next with the monotony I had grown accustomed to. At first, there was nothing that caught my attention. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours. The occasional sound of a printer whirring or a door creaking added to the office's symphony of ambient noises. My coworkers, if they were still there, were quiet, only interrupting the stillness with the occasional rustle of paper or the low murmur of their own conversations. The world outside the call center felt distant, almost irrelevant to what was going on within these four walls. But then it happened. At first, I barely noticed. It was a phone call, but not the kind I was used to. It came in at exactly 9:23 p.m., a time I'll never forget. I was deep in a conversation with a frustrated customer who couldn't seem to get their issue resolved. The usual routine: listening, responding, offering assistance. But in the middle of that call, the screen in front of me flashed a notification. It wasn't one of the usual identifiers I would see for an incoming call. It wasn't marked by the usual customer number, nor was it from the queue that we usually handled. It was just a number. A dead phone number. At first, I thought it was some sort of error, a glitch. I had seen strange things happen in the system before. Sometimes a call would come through that was misdirected or not routed properly. But something about this felt off. I hesitated for just a moment, staring at the screen. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I had worked in customer service long enough to know that strange things sometimes happen with technology, and I told myself not to worry. I clicked the green button to answer the call, doing my best to push aside the unsettling feeling in my chest. "Hello, thank you for calling. This is my name. How may I assist you today?" There was no response. The line was silent, and I frowned. I repeated my greeting, wondering if maybe the call had accidentally been connected to someone who wasn't ready to speak yet. But there was still no sound, just complete silence, as though the call was coming from nowhere. "Hello," I said again, a little more sharply now, thinking perhaps it was a prank call or some kind of mistake. I pulled the headset away from my ear briefly and looked at the screen. No one was on the other end. I was about to hang up when I heard something. It wasn't exactly a voice, but it was there. It was faint, like a soft, muffled sound in the background, as though someone was talking just out of earshot. I leaned in closer to the headset, my curiosity piqued. The sound continued, low and unintelligible at first, but growing slightly clearer the longer I listened. It was almost like a whisper, but it wasn't distinct enough for me to make out any words. My heart rate picked up, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't right. I had worked here long enough to recognize a wrong number or a technical issue, but this felt different. I cleared my throat and asked once more, "Is anyone there?" For a moment, there was nothing, just more of that strange, soft noise. But then, clearly and unmistakably, I heard it. "Help!" It wasn't a voice that I recognized. It wasn't a voice from any of my customers, and it certainly wasn't the friendly, professional tone that we were trained to deliver. It sounded desperate, a faint, eerie plea that seemed to resonate in my ears, lingering even after the words had faded. My stomach churned. I quickly looked over to the other agents in the room, but they were all busy, their heads bent over their screens, oblivious to the strange call I was handling. There was no one I could turn to in that moment, no one who could explain what was happening. I glanced at the call details once again. Still no name, just that strange, empty number. The air around me felt thick, heavy, and I could feel the tension in my chest tightening with each passing second. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I'd heard stories before, urban legends, of haunted phone lines and strange calls that people had received, but I had never thought anything of them. This was different. I quickly ended the call, hoping that whatever had just happened would vanish with the click of the button. But as soon as I hit the red button to end the call, the sound in the headset abruptly stopped. It was as if it had never happened. I sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My thoughts raced. Was it a prank? A technical glitch? Some kind of malfunction with the system? I couldn't explain it, but something about it felt wrong. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just a regular call. It felt intentional, like someone or something was reaching out, trying to get my attention. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself. This wasn't the first weird call I'd received. There had been others, but they were easily explainable, misrouted calls, a wrong number, maybe even a little weird timing. But this was different. I glanced around the room, as if expecting to see someone standing behind me, watching me. But the office was still, empty save for the soft hum of the machines around me. I told myself to shake it off. It was probably just a glitch, nothing more. After all, I had to focus on the job. The clock was ticking, and I had a lot of work to do. So I tried to move on, answered a few more calls, and convinced myself that I was just overreacting. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Something had just crossed the line from strange to unsettling, and I couldn't shake it. The whispering voice, soft and pleading, was still in my mind, echoing in my thoughts. And I couldn't help but wonder, had I heard it from a person? Or was it something else, something that shouldn't have been on the other end of the line? I didn't want to think about it anymore, so I buried myself in my work, hoping the call would be nothing more than a strange anomaly. But that feeling? It stayed with me, lingering in the background like a shadow that refused to leave. The calls kept coming in, as they always did, each one blending into the next. But the strange phone call I had received, the one with the pleading voice, remained at the back of my mind. It gnawed at me like a constant hum, just below the surface of my thoughts. I tried to brush it off, but the unease refused to fade. I could still hear the faint echo of that voice in my ears, haunting me during the quiet moments of the night. At first, it was easy to tell myself that it was just a technical glitch, a freak occurrence that had no real explanation. But as the days passed, the strange events began to happen more frequently. It started with small things, little incidents that on their own might have seemed insignificant, but together they began to build a sense of dread. One evening, as I was sitting at my desk, a call came through at precisely 10:47 p.m. It was the same strange number. My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen, the same feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I had been expecting it, in a way. It was as if I knew it was coming before it even happened. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the mouse. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, the part that was now obsessed with figuring out what was going on, compelled me to pick up the call. I answered it, but this time, there was no silence. There was no hesitation. The moment I put the headset on, I heard it, a voice, clear and cold, cutting through the air like ice. "Don't answer again." The words were sharp, but they were so faint, barely audible over the static. I jerked back, pulling the headset away from my ear in shock. The voice had been unmistakable, chilling in its tone. It wasn't a request. It was a command, an order. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to end the call. I slammed the red button on the phone, and the line went dead. I sat there, frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I looked around the office, but everything seemed normal. The other agents were still engrossed in their work, none of them aware of the strange encounter I had just had. The buzz of the fluorescent lights above me, the tapping of keyboards, it was all so mundane, so ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I pulled up the call log on my screen, trying to make sense of it. There was nothing unusual about the system. No explanation for why this number kept calling. No record of anyone else having received a similar call. Just the same number, over and over, like a ghost trapped in the system. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The office was nearly empty, save for a few of us working late into the night. The silence felt oppressive now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. It was just the hum of the machines and the distant sound of phones ringing. Then it happened again. A few hours later, the same number appeared on my screen. I hesitated this time, my heart racing as I looked at the flashing lights. But despite everything, despite the fear that gripped me, I answered it again. This time, there was no voice, just a low, guttural noise, like something breathing heavily on the other end. I could hear it clearly, as though the person or whatever it was right next to me. The breath was slow, steady, but uneven. It felt suffocating, oppressive, as though it were coming from a deep, dark place. I quickly ended the call, my hands shaking as I did. I looked around again, feeling as though the room itself was closing in on me. My colleagues hadn't noticed. They were all busy with their own work, their heads down, their attention focused on their screens. But the weight of the atmosphere was unbearable. The more I tried to focus on my work, the more the air around me seemed to thicken, as though it were charged with static electricity. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone standing behind me, just out of sight. The thought made my skin crawl, but I brushed it aside. It was ridiculous. It had to be. But the strange calls didn't stop. They kept coming. Every night, at random intervals, the same number would appear on my screen. The whispers, the heavy breathing, the muffled voices, they all began to blur together in a constant, unrelenting wave of unease. And it wasn't just the calls. Other strange things began happening around the office. One night, while I was sitting at my desk, I noticed something strange. The light above my workstation flickered, a faint buzzing sound accompanying it. I looked up, expecting it to stop, but it didn't. It flickered again, and then again. A few seconds later, it went completely dark, leaving me in the dim light from my computer screen. I frowned, looking around the office. The other lights were still on, but for some reason, mine had gone out. I stood up, intending to get maintenance, but before I could move, the light flickered back on. It didn't just turn on normally, it snapped to life with a violent crack, followed by a brief, unsettling static noise. I froze, staring at the light. It wasn't right. It was as if it had been tampered with, like something was interfering with the power. I decided to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand. But as I sat back down, my eyes caught movement in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was one of my coworkers, but when I looked, no one was there. The office was still, quiet, and empty. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard something else, something faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallway behind me. I jumped, my heart racing, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I quickly got up and checked the hallway, but it was empty. No footsteps. No shadows. Just the cold, sterile silence of the office. I returned to my desk, unsettled, but trying to ignore the feeling that someone was nearby. I tried to focus on my work, but the calls kept coming, each one more unnerving than the last. The whispers became clearer, the breathing heavier. And with each call, the tension in the air grew thicker, more suffocating. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. I had to figure out what was going on. But as I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I felt a growing sense of dread creeping over me. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. It wasn't just a technical issue. It wasn't just a strange glitch. Someone was trying to reach me, and I didn't know how much longer I could ignore it. It had been weeks since the calls began, and the toll they had taken on me was undeniable. The once mundane routine of answering calls had turned into a psychological battle. The other agents around me seemed oblivious to the tension that weighed down the room, but I felt it in every corner, every flicker of light, every odd noise that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. Who would believe me? The thought of sounding crazy, of becoming the subject of gossip around the office, kept me silent. But silence was becoming harder to maintain. I was no longer just a passive participant in this strange, relentless game. I was being dragged deeper into it, whether I liked it or not. It was a Tuesday night, just past midnight, when it finally happened. I had been working late, trying to block out the fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The office was empty, save for the quiet hum of the computers and the occasional beep of the phones. I sat in my cubicle, staring at the screen, my fingers mechanically typing out responses, my mind only half focused on the work at hand. The rest of the world felt far away, as though it didn't matter anymore. That's when it happened. The phone rang. The same number, the one that had been calling me for days, weeks even. The screen flashed the same eerie digits. This time, I didn't hesitate. My fingers, though trembling, reached for the headset. I wasn't sure if I was hoping to finally confront whatever or whoever was on the other end, or if I was just too exhausted to care anymore. I pressed the green button. The line was silent at first, that same oppressive quiet that had become a hallmark of these calls. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything. And then, out of the silence, came the unmistakable sound of a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time, or the faint echo of distant breathing. It was loud, clear, and unmistakable. "I warned you." The voice was deep and guttural, a distorted sound that sent chills racing down my spine. It was as if it came from somewhere beyond the phone, as if the voice itself was not human, but something otherworldly. The words weren't just a statement, they were a command, an ultimatum, and they were meant for me. I froze, unable to respond, my heart hammering in my chest. But then, the voice continued, this time with more intensity, more authority. "You shouldn't have answered." It wasn't just the words. It was the way they vibrated through me. I could feel them in my bones, reverberating through the air in a way that made my entire body feel cold, numb. I could hear the faint static, but the voice itself seemed to come from the very room around me. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against me, suffocating me. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. My pulse raced in my ears, drowning out everything else. There was a long pause, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I thought the call had ended, that the line had gone dead. But then the voice returned, this time softer, more menacing. "I'm here, watching, waiting." And then the line went dead. The sudden silence was deafening. I pulled the headset away from my ears, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My throat was dry, and I could barely breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was this real? Was it a prank? No, this wasn't some sick joke. It felt too real, too personal, too alive. I quickly checked the call log. There was no trace of the call, no record of it, nothing. It was as if it had never happened. The number was gone, erased from the system. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what had just happened. The unease that had been building in me for weeks was now a full-blown panic. I glanced around the office, hoping someone would acknowledge the horror that had just unfolded. But no one seemed to notice. Everyone was still glued to their screens, working, oblivious to the terror that had just shaken me to my core. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly, and walked toward the break room, needing to get away from my desk. I needed to breathe. As I passed by the other cubicles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air around me seemed thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, flickering for just a moment before going steady again. When I entered the break room, I noticed something odd. The vending machine in the corner was flashing an odd, rhythmic light. The kind of malfunction that was usually harmless, but in this moment, it felt unsettling. I walked over to it, thinking it was just a glitch, but as I stood there, I realized something. The machine wasn't flashing randomly. It was blinking in a pattern, as though it were trying to communicate something. A chill crept down my spine, and I stepped back. "Don't ignore me." I heard the voice again, clear and close, as though it were right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. No one was there. The room was empty. The voice had come from the machine, from the very air around me. The vending machine was silent now, its light flickering as if nothing had happened. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my bag, not bothering to pack up my things, and made my way toward the exit. But as I reached the door, something stopped me, a feeling, a presence. I turned around slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Standing at the far end of the room was a figure. It was tall, shadowy, its form barely visible in the dim light. I could make out nothing about it, no distinguishing features, just the outline of a person, or something that resembled a person, standing perfectly still. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the building, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air felt lighter, but the weight of the encounter lingered. I stumbled out of the building, into the cold night air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The city around me felt foreign, distant, like I wasn't supposed to be there. As I stood outside, trying to steady my breathing, I realized something. The voice, the presence, it wasn't just trying to scare me. It was trying to send me a message. It was warning me. But of what? And why? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The following days were a blur. I couldn't focus at work, my mind constantly replaying the events from that night. The unsettling voice, the shadowy figure in the break room, and the inexplicable feelings that clung to me like a second skin. I knew I couldn't continue like this. Something had to be done. I had to find out who or what was behind it all. The unease that had followed me home, into my dreams, and even into the daylight hours, wasn't something I could ignore any longer. But I wasn't sure where to turn. What could I do? Who would believe me? My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, and every time I tried to get a grip on the situation, I was met with more questions than answers. The following morning, I went into work early, hoping to get some peace before anyone else arrived. The office was empty, save for a few cleaning staff moving about, wiping down desks and emptying trash bins. I walked past the cubicles, my eyes darting around nervously, expecting to see the figure from the night before, to hear the voice again. But the office was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt thick, as though something was still lingering, just out of sight. I made my way to my desk, my hands still trembling from the events of the previous night, and sat down. My computer screen flickered, as if it had been waiting for me to arrive, and the phones were silent. For the first time in a long time, it almost felt normal. I was wrong to think that peace could return, however. As the hours ticked by and the other agents trickled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The lights above flickered again, but this time I didn't even jump. The strange things that had haunted me for weeks had become a constant presence in my mind. There was no more running from it. I had to confront whatever this was head on. By mid-morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to do something drastic. I had to get to the bottom of this. But where to start? I had already checked the call logs. There was no record of the strange calls, nothing to help me trace who had been reaching out to me. I thought back to the vending machine incident, how it had flickered in a pattern, almost like it was trying to tell me something. I decided to go to the one place I had yet to explore, the server room. I made my way through the office, avoiding the gaze of my colleagues, who were too busy to notice my determined pace. I reached the door to the server room, which was usually locked, but today it was open. The smell of cold air hit me as I stepped inside, the faint hum of the servers in the background. I walked up to one of the computer terminals and sat down, pulling up the system logs. For a few moments, everything seemed normal. The logs were full of routine data, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, something caught my eye. There were irregularities, unexplained entries in the system. It was as if the computers had been accessed remotely, even though there was no record of anyone logging in. I scrolled down, my heart beginning to race as I noticed something even more alarming. There were multiple instances of data being deleted or overwritten. The logs were being tampered with, and someone or something was covering its tracks. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing when I heard it again, the voice. This time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the speakers of the computer, loud and clear. "I told you to leave." I jumped back from the screen, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The office around me felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. The voice didn't come through the phone this time, but through the very system I had been relying on to uncover the truth. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching me, toying with me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I needed answers. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I typed a quick command into the computer to trace the source of the anomaly. The screen flickered, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of a dial-up connection, an old, static-filled noise that didn't belong in the modern digital world. It was the sound of something trying to connect from far away, something reaching out from beyond the confines of the building. And then there was a shift. The air in the room grew colder, the hum of the servers growing louder, almost deafening. The lights above flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the walls. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath fog in front of me. I felt a sudden wave of dread crash over me, a feeling so intense that it threatened to consume me whole. Leave it alone. This time, the voice was unmistakable, clear, and full of malice. It didn't sound like a warning anymore, it was a demand. I glanced at the screen again, and the words that appeared there were like a punch to my gut. You should never have listened. Now you're mine. I slammed my hands down on the keyboard, trying to break the connection, to stop whatever was happening. But it was no use. The screen continued to flash, the words mocking me, each one more disturbing than the last. The lights above flickered one last time, before plunging the room into darkness. I tried to leave, to escape, but as I turned toward the door, I was met by a figure in the doorway. It was the same shadowy figure I had seen in the break room. It stood there, blocking my escape, its form hazy and indistinct, as though it were made of smoke or shadows. Where do you think you're going? The voice hissed. Panic surged through me. My legs felt weak, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't give in to fear. I had to fight back. I reached for the nearest object, an old, dusty binder, and hurled it at the figure. But it passed through it as though it were nothing more than air. The figure stepped forward, its presence so overwhelming that I could feel it closing in on me, suffocating me. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The lights flickered back on, and the air in the room felt less oppressive. The temperature returned to normal, and the hum of the servers faded back into the background. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed, unsure of what had just happened. My heart was still racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But it was over, at least for now. I stumbled out of the server room and back into the office, my legs unsteady beneath me. I glanced around, looking for any sign of the others, but everyone was still oblivious to the events that had unfolded. The office was silent, and the only sound was the steady clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of voices. As I left work that night, I realized something. The thing that had been haunting me, tormenting me, it wasn't going to stop. It had marked me, claimed me, and it wouldn't let me go. I had tried to run, to uncover the truth, but all I had uncovered was more fear, more confusion. And now, I was left with a single, terrifying question. What did it want from me? And what was I willing to do to make it stop? The days that followed felt like a blur, but a distinct sense of heaviness lingered in the air wherever I went. I tried to continue with my routine, going through the motions, pretending that everything was fine, but something had shifted inside me. The experiences in the office were no longer just disturbing memories, they had become part of who I was. A shadow that would never leave me. I continued to work at the call center, trying to keep my head down, but it was impossible to ignore the change in the air. The whispers, the flickering lights, and the cold air had all returned. Only this time, it wasn't just the servers acting up. It was everywhere in my desk, in the break room, and even in the elevator. The voice, the one I had heard on the phone, the one that had spoken through the speakers in the server room, was no longer confined to the machines. It was in my head, constantly, whispering things I couldn't understand, pulling me further into a world that didn't feel real. The eerie feeling of being watched didn't go away either. Every time I walked through the office, every time I spoke to a colleague, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was alive, that something had been awakened and was now waiting for me to make a wrong move. I tried to tell myself it was just stress burnout from long hours in the office, perhaps, But deep down, I knew it was something far worse. I thought about quitting. I thought about walking away from everything and leaving the nightmare behind. But the truth was, I couldn't. The office had already sunk its claws into me, and every time I tried to leave, the darkness followed. It wasn't just the whispers anymore, it was the fear. The fear that if I ran, I'd never be able to escape. That wherever I went, whatever I did, the thing in the shadows would always be there, lurking in the background, just waiting for me to slip up. And so I stayed. The weeks dragged on, but the events at the call center grew stranger. The voice became more persistent, more urgent. It didn't just speak through the phones or the speakers anymore. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air I breathed. I could feel it everywhere, pressing down on me like a weight that grew heavier by the day. One night, as I worked late again, trying to escape the noise in my head, I found myself alone in the office. The rest of the staff had already left, and the building was silent, save for the low hum of the servers in the back. I tried to focus on the task in front of me, but the voice kept pulling my attention, growing louder with each passing second. It was almost as if it was speaking directly to me now. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. I was done ignoring it. I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. I marched down the hallway to the server room, determined to put an end to it once and for all. The door to the room stood ajar, and I pushed it open, only to be met by a sight I'll never forget. The room was bathed in an unnatural glow. The servers, which had always been a dull gray, now pulsed with a soft blue light. It was as though they were alive, their hums resonating like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature. I approached one of the terminals, my hand shaking as I typed in the password. The screen flickered and then came to life, displaying a series of strange symbols I didn't recognize. Then I heard the voice again. Not from the speakers, not from the phone, but from behind me. I turned, my heart racing. It was there. The figure, the shadow that had tormented me for weeks, stood in the doorway, its shape more defined now. It wasn't just a blur of smoke and darkness anymore. It had a face, though its features were blurred, like an unfinished drawing. It was smiling, but there was nothing warm or friendly about the expression. It was as if it were savoring the fear that consumed me. "You should have left," it said, its voice low and cold, yet somehow filled with amusement. "Now, you're part of this. There's no escaping." I froze, my blood running cold. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just haunting the building, it was the building. It was the servers, the phones, the very fabric of the place. The thing that had been haunting me was not a ghost, not a spirit, but something much darker. Something that had been built into the call center itself, woven into the very systems that kept the place running. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning. "Now, you're mine," the figure whispered, its grin widening. The room seemed to close in on me, the lights flickering wildly, the servers humming louder until it felt like the entire building was vibrating. I could feel myself being pulled into the darkness, unable to move, unable to escape. But just as I thought I would be consumed by it all, everything stopped. The lights returned to normal, the humming quieted, and the figure was gone. I stood there, trembling, feeling as though I had just barely escaped some fate worse than death. But the aftermath wasn't what I had expected. The next morning, everything was normal again. The office buzzed with activity. The employees went about their tasks as though nothing had happened. The fear that had haunted me just hours before seemed to dissipate, leaving only a vague unease in its wake. I sat at my desk, my hands still shaking, trying to convince myself that it was over. But deep down, I knew the truth. The call center, the entity within it, hadn't finished with me. It was still there, waiting, watching. The things we don't understand are often the things that haunt us the most. I thought I could outrun it, thought that by facing the darkness, I could defeat it. But I was wrong. I hadn't escaped, I had become part of it. And as I looked around the office, I knew one thing for sure. No matter how hard I tried to leave, the call center would always be there, waiting for me to return. And the voice, it would always be there, whispering in my ear. I work as a night clerk at a small hotel on the outskirts of this sleepy town. It's one of those places that most people wouldn't pay attention to. You know, the kind of hotel where guests are rarely seen and the lights are dim, giving it a quiet, unremarkable atmosphere. It sits tucked away on a forgotten corner of the main highway. The kind of place where you check in, go to your room, and leave without ever remembering the name of the place. The night shift is usually uneventful. It's just me and the occasional traveler who stops by for a night's rest. Sometimes the hours drag on in absolute silence, with only the occasional beep of the computer or the soft sound of the air conditioner in the lobby to break the stillness. There's a predictable rhythm to the work, check-ins, check-outs, and a whole lot of waiting. But one evening, something happened that shattered that predictability. Something that, to this day, I can't explain. That night was no different at first. I was seated behind the front desk, staring at the clock, trying to keep myself awake. The hours had been dragging on, as they often do on those late-night shifts, and it was almost time for me to finish. The hotel was nearly empty. I hadn't checked in a guest for the last couple of hours, and it was getting quiet. Then, around 2 a.m., I received a notification on my system. A room, number 307, had been occupied. The system listed the room as being booked, but the problem was, no one had checked in. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened, but it was strange. I double-checked the reservation logs, nothing. The room had been assigned, but no one had given me their name, payment, or any indication that they had actually checked in. Curious, I stood up and walked to the back office, where the records were kept, to see if there was a note from any of my coworkers. There was nothing. No message, no special instructions. Nothing. I knew the system could sometimes be glitchy, especially late at night, but this felt different. There was an odd, unexplained feeling creeping up on me, something I couldn't shake. As I walked back to the front desk, I glanced at the hallway leading to the rooms. It was eerily quiet, but that was nothing new. Still, I couldn't help but feel a strange tension in the air. It's as though the hotel itself was holding its breath. I sat back down at the desk and waited, thinking that the error would resolve itself, but I had a strange urge to check the room anyway. I grabbed the master key and, without much thought, headed down the hall toward room 307. I wasn't expecting anything, really just another glitch in the system that would be easily resolved. But when I reached the door and inserted the key, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door opened, but no one was inside. Yet, the bed was perfectly made, the lights were dimly lit, and the room had that strange, sterile smell of a hotel room that had been recently cleaned. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The room was clearly occupied. I could hear a faint hum from the bathroom, but there was no one around. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. But then, as I turned to leave, I noticed something else. The window, slightly ajar, let in a cold draft that made the room feel even emptier. The curtains swayed gently. I walked back down the hall, my thoughts spinning, but the unease in my stomach only grew. Had I missed something? Maybe someone had checked in earlier and left, though I hadn't heard anyone at all. It didn't add up. And so, with that, I returned to the front desk, still uneasy, but hoping the strange incident was just a minor blip. What I didn't know at the time was that this would be only the beginning. Something was stirring in that hotel, something that would soon make itself known. As I sat back down at the desk, I glanced up at the security monitor, expecting to see the usual quiet hallways. But instead, I saw something that I can't explain. A figure, a shadow, moving down the hallway toward room 307. I froze, heart pounding. The sight of that shadow in the security monitor, moving steadily down the hallway, sent an icy shock through my veins. For a moment, I thought it might just be a trick of the light, a glitch in the system, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me due to the late hour. But the figure moved with purpose, its shape vague but distinct. It wasn't a reflection or a fluke of the camera. There was something undeniably real about it. I immediately stood up, my legs shaky as if they had betrayed me. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I wasn't sure what to think. I glanced back at the screen, but the figure had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The hallway was empty once again, bathed in the dull yellow light that made everything look eerily quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe I had just been seeing things. After all, it had been a long shift, and I was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion. The dark circles under my eyes, no doubt, were evidence of that. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I sat back down behind the desk and tried to distract myself. I focused on the computer screen, staring at the booking system in front of me, hoping to calm my racing heart. The keys clicked beneath my fingers, the familiar sound of normality. But just as I was about to tell myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination, the lobby door opened. I looked up, expecting a guest, but no one came in. The door had swung open by itself, the wind from outside causing the handle to turn and the door to creak open ever so slightly. It was nothing, I tried to convince myself, a simple draft. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up once more, and I couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense that something had shifted in the atmosphere. I stood up again and walked to the door, closing it with a little more force than usual. I double-checked the lock, making sure it was secure. The door didn't move again after that, but the uneasy feeling remained. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 3 a.m. now. The night was dragging on, and I was getting more and more anxious by the minute. As I returned to my post at the desk, I couldn't help but notice that the room key for 307, the room I had checked earlier, was now sitting on the counter. I didn't remember putting it there. A sense of dread started to settle in, weighing heavily on my chest. It felt as though the hotel had become an entirely different place, one that I didn't understand. I was still trying to make sense of the shadow I had seen on the monitor when my phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from the manager, a man who was usually quick to respond to any issues at the hotel. He had been more of a silent presence in my life than anything else, and I never expected him to text me in the middle of the night. The message was short and simple. Check on room 307. Something strange has been happening there. Don't tell anyone else. My pulse quickened. I had no idea what was going on, but now it was clear that I wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. Something about that room had always felt off, but I never paid it much mind. But now, with the manager's message, I had no choice but to investigate further. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the master key again. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that everything would be fine. I had already checked the room once, but the unease inside me was growing, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I made my way down the hallway, the same path I had taken before, but this time the air felt heavier. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting strange shadows along the walls. The faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to echo louder than usual, and the hallway stretched on endlessly. When I reached room 307, I paused. There was no sound from inside. No voices, no footsteps, no indication that the room was occupied at all. But I felt an overwhelming need to open the door again, as if I had to prove something to myself. I inserted the key, the familiar click of the lock unlocking, sending a shiver down my spine. As I opened the door, I was hit with the same cold draft from before. But this time, I noticed something else. The bed was no longer neatly made. The covers were twisted, the sheets ruffled as if someone had been lying there recently. But the room was still empty. The lights were dim, but they flickered slightly, as though struggling to stay on. I stepped inside, my heart racing, and felt the same strange sensation that I couldn't shake. The room felt wrong, like it was waiting for something or someone. I checked the bathroom, but it was empty. No sign of any guest. No personal belongings. Just the cold, clinical cleanliness of a hotel room. As I turned to leave, The hairs on my arms tingled, and I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A quick movement, a shadow darting across the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly glanced at the door, ready to bolt, but nothing was there. It was as if the room itself had shifted, something invisible pressing down on me. I had to leave. I couldn't stay there anymore. I slammed the door shut and rushed back to the front desk, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I arrived at the desk, the night seemed to return to its eerie quietness, but it didn't feel the same. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and suffocating. I sat down again, my mind racing, but I didn't know what to do next. I couldn't explain what I had just seen. I had checked the room earlier, and it had been fine. But now, it was as though someone or something was actively trying to make me question my sanity. As I sat there in the silence, the feeling of being watched crept over me. The sensation grew stronger and stronger until I couldn't ignore it anymore. My eyes darted to the hallway camera feed again, and for a split second, I saw it, the shadow again, moving, but this time closer. I had no words, only a sinking feeling that I was not alone in the hotel anymore. The air in the hotel had changed. It was thick, as though the very walls were closing in, suffocating me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake off. The unease had grown from a whisper in my mind to a constant, pounding drumbeat. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, every gust of wind against the windows now seemed charged with an ominous energy. I could no longer ignore it. I had to find out what was happening, what was making the hotel feel so wrong. The days that followed only deepened the sense of something being terribly off. It wasn't just the strange events with room 307 anymore. It was the entire building. On my shift that next evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon and darkness poured into the lobby, I decided to take a more active approach. The manager's message still hung in my mind, his cryptic warning adding weight to the growing fear. I couldn't just sit behind the desk, pretending everything was fine. There had to be an explanation. The logical part of me clung to the thought that there had to be a reasonable explanation for everything, but it was quickly becoming harder to believe. I checked the booking system again. Room 307 was marked as vacant, but I knew it wasn't. A chill ran down my spine, and I stood up, my breath shallow. It had to be a mistake. I quickly grabbed the master key and made my way to the room. As I walked down the hallway, the fluorescent lights flickered more frequently now, casting the walls in an unsettling, erratic glow. It made the shadows seem deeper, longer, like they were stretching to reach me. When I reached room 307, the door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it that way. My heart began to race as I pushed it open, stepping inside with trepidation. I was immediately hit by the same cold draft, more intense than before, and the strange sense of anticipation that seemed to hang in the air. This time, I was determined to search every corner of the room. The bed, as before, was disheveled, the sheets twisted as if someone had tossed and turned in their sleep. But there was no sign of anyone. The room looked abandoned, yet it didn't feel that way. There was something about it, something alive in the stillness. I opened the closet. Empty. The drawers? Empty. But then I spotted something. A small, unmarked envelope sitting in the middle of the desk. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, but when I opened it, there was nothing inside, just a plain white sheet of paper, blank, with nothing written on it. My eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner for any clue, any sign of someone else being here. I could feel the temperature in the room dropping, and with it, a growing pressure in my chest. It was as if the very air itself had become oppressive, thick with something I couldn't name. I shook my head, trying to push the growing panic out of my mind. There had to be a logical explanation. I had to focus. But as I turned to leave, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a dark smudge on the floor near the foot of the bed. I bent down to investigate it, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The smudge was fresh, a deep, dark stain that looked almost like blood. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, sending a quick message to the manager. I couldn't deal with this on my own, but as I typed, the lights above flickered violently, and for a split second, the entire room plunged into darkness. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The lights flickered back on, but everything felt different. The air was heavier, the silence deafening. I couldn't wait for the manager anymore. I needed to act. I needed answers. I ran down the hallway toward the storage rooms at the back of the hotel, where I knew there were old files and records that could tell me more about room 307. Maybe I was grasping at straws, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like something was being hidden from me, something I wasn't meant to understand. As I rifled through the dusty files in the storage room, I found the old registry books. The hotel had been around for decades, and the records went back much further than I had anticipated. I flipped through page after page, searching for any mention of room 307. The more I looked, the stranger the entries became. There were numerous cancellations in the guest list for room 307. A lot of them were marked as no show, but it was the names that stood out. The same names seemed to appear over and over again. A name I didn't recognize kept showing up, but curiously, no one had ever checked in under it. There were always scribbled notes next to the name, left early, no payment received, and most disturbingly, unresolved issue. Something was definitely wrong with room 307, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. The more I stared at the records, the more my head began to spin. A feeling of disorientation settled over me, as though the walls were closing in on me. The air in the storage room had become thick and suffocating, and a dull ringing sound filled my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. I closed the files abruptly, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of here before it consumed me too. But as I made my way toward the exit, something strange caught my eye. The door to the maintenance closet was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, but now the faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. I stepped closer, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The dim light inside flickered, casting strange shadows across the floor. And then, in the far corner, I saw something. A figure. A person, standing motionless in the dark. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, in the corner, watching me with eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. My pulse raced as I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, my hands trembling. When the light hit the corner again, there was nothing there. Nothing but the overwhelming, suffocating silence that had become the new heartbeat of the hotel. I didn't stay much longer after that. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, and I knew I had to get out before it was too late. But just as I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed again. It was another message from the manager. Room 307 is not meant to be booked. Don't go back in there. It never should have been. I stared at the message, feeling my world tilt sideways. Something was very, very wrong with that room. And now, it felt like it was closing in on me. I stood in the lobby, heart racing, trying to steady my breath. The words from the manager echoed in my mind like a scream in the distance. Room 307 is not meant to be booked. Don't go back in there. It never should have been. But I was beyond rational thought. The pull to uncover the truth, to make sense of what had been happening, was stronger than the fear that gripped me. It was like a magnet, drawing me back to room 307, urging me to go back in, to find the answers no matter the cost. I couldn't leave. Not now. I texted the manager back, asking him why room 307 was off limits. But when I hit send, I realized my phone was no longer connected to the hotel Wi-Fi. No bars. Nothing. Just that sinking, oppressive silence that seemed to seep into everything. I felt a pang of panic, but I pushed it down. There was no turning back now. With trembling hands, I grabbed the master key again and made my way to the room. My footsteps echoed through the hallway, bouncing off the walls, amplifying the growing sense of dread that weighed on my chest. Each step felt heavier than the last. The hotel felt different tonight. The air was still, but thick with something I couldn't name, something that seemed to wrap around me like a cold fog. When I reached room 307, the door was ajar once again, just as it had been earlier. I pushed it open slowly, the rusted hinges protest as I stepped inside. The room was still and cold, yet it felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to breathe with the weight of history, with the weight of something that had been forgotten but was never truly gone. I moved cautiously into the room, every sense on high alert. The lights flickered once more, casting strange, distorted shadows across the room. But this time, something felt different. The air felt thicker, colder. The silence had become suffocating, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the foot of the bed. For a moment, I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a shadow, an outline of something that didn't belong. It was tall, its features obscured by the dim light, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. My legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't look away. Who are you? I croaked, my voice barely audible. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I was speaking in a language I didn't understand. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, unblinking, unmoving. But then, a faint sound filled the room. It was a low hum, like the whirring of an old machine, a sound that reverberated through my chest. It was coming from the figure. And then, the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately. My pulse quickened, and for the first time, I turned to leave. I wasn't ready for this. Whatever this was, it was beyond me. But before I could take a step, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. I spun around, my heart racing, panic rising in my throat. The figure was closer now, only a few feet away. Its features were still obscured, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me like a physical weight. And then, it spoke. A voice, cold and distant, filled the room. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was a rasping whisper, as though the sound itself had been pulled from the depths of something ancient. You shouldn't have come, it rasped, the voice sounding like it was both far away and directly inside my head. The words were full of malice, of something older and darker than I could comprehend. I backed away, my hands shaking as I reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The figure was closer now, its form flickering like a broken light, shifting between the shadows. It felt like the room itself was bending, warping around me, as though reality was no longer sure of itself. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was pulling the very soul from my body. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The terror that held me in place was more than fear. It was something primal, something deep in my bones that told me I was no longer in control. I was at the mercy of whatever this was. And then it moved again. The room seemed to distort as the figure glided forward, its presence filling every corner of the space. It reached out, its form shifting, its hand, or what I could only assume was a hand, reaching toward me with unnatural speed. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable impact, but when it didn't come, I opened them again. The figure had stopped. Its hand hovered inches from my face, and in that moment, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't a person at all. It was something far worse. Its body was a writhing mass of shadows and flickering light, like it was made from the darkness itself, a thing of the void. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a blur of shifting shapes, its eyes hollow pits that stared into me, into my very soul. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I realized the truth. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't alive. It wasn't human. It was something far darker, something that had existed long before the hotel had ever been built, long before I had ever stepped foot in this cursed place. It was death. It was the thing that haunted this hotel, the thing that had been lurking in room 307 for as long as anyone could remember. And now it had found me. The air grew colder, and I could feel my strength slipping away. The room began to spin, the walls warping around me, the shadows closing in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the grip of something far beyond my understanding. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure was gone. The door swung open, and I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air, my mind reeling. I didn't know what had happened, what that thing had been, but I knew one thing for certain. Room 307 was never meant to be entered. It was a place of darkness, of something beyond our world, and I had no business being there. But as I ran down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever I had unleashed in room 307 was still with me, still watching, waiting for the moment when it would strike again. And I had a sinking feeling that I wouldn't be the last to encounter it. The hotel was silent once more, but I knew the silence was a lie. I didn't know where to go, but I ran. My footsteps echoed down the long hallway, each beat like a drum in my chest. I had to get out. The terror that gripped me had become physical, like a weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me with every breath I tried to take. The air felt thick, stale, as if the hotel itself was trying to hold me here, to keep me locked in its grip. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the sounds of my frantic flight. But in the back of my mind, a question lingered. What had I just witnessed? What was that thing? And why had it chosen me? I rounded the corner, my legs heavy with exhaustion, my mind reeling with every memory of what had just happened. I could still feel the oppressive presence of that shadow, its eyes burning into me, its cold voice echoing in my mind. It was as if the hotel itself had become a living thing, a parasite feeding off the fear it instilled in everyone who stepped through its doors. I reached the front desk, but the lobby was empty, eerily so. There was no sign of the manager, no one to tell me what was going on or what I was supposed to do now. The hotel felt abandoned, as if everyone had just vanished. But I knew that wasn't the case. The hotel was full, at least it was supposed to be. My brain felt foggy, as if the events that had unfolded weren't entirely real, but they were. I knew they were. I had been there. I had seen it. I stood there for a moment, looking around, trying to make sense of everything. The clock above the desk ticked loudly in the silence. It was only now that I realized the time. Nearly 3 a.m. The dead of night. The perfect time for things to go wrong, for everything to fall apart. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do next. Should I leave? Could I even leave? My mind was in chaos, pulling me in different directions. It didn't help that the door to the hotel had been locked, as though the world outside had disappeared along with the events inside. But then I heard a faint sound at first, like a low hum, like the buzzing of an old television set on the brink of static. I turned around, looking for its source, but the lobby was still empty. No one in sight. Yet the noise persisted, growing louder, more distinct. I walked toward the back of the hotel, instinctively following the sound. I had no reason to go back into the depths of the hotel, to retrace my steps through the hallways I'd just fled, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was pulling me forward, urging me to go, to find the answers, to uncover the truth. I reached the hallway leading to room 307. The door was still open, but now it felt different. There was no flickering light, no ominous shadows. The air was still thick, but there was a sense of emptiness, like the space had been abandoned. Yet I knew it hadn't. Something lingered just beyond the edge of perception. I stepped inside, my breath shallow, my nerves on edge. The room was just as it had been before, with the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn, everything in its place as though nothing had happened. But it had happened. I had seen it. I had felt it. That presence, those eyes. I took a hesitant step forward, and that's when I noticed something. On the wall near the bed, there was a faint outline, It was barely visible, a shadow against the wallpaper, but it was there. A shape, like something that had been burned into the wall, or perhaps something that had been left behind. I approached it cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed against the wall, the temperature in the room dropped. A chill ran through me, sharp and biting, and I pulled my hand back instinctively. The outline on the wall seemed to pulse, as if it was alive, reacting to my touch. My breath quickened, and I stepped back, suddenly overwhelmed by the sense that I was no longer alone. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard something behind me, a voice, soft and indistinct, like a whisper, but it wasn't coming from anywhere. It was coming from within the walls themselves. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, but the room was empty. No figure, no shadow, nothing but the outline on the wall. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped, my pulse racing. This was it. I had to leave. Whatever was happening in this hotel, it wasn't something I could fix. It wasn't something I could understand. I wasn't meant to understand it. I ran back to the front desk, my thoughts in a blur. I had to get out. I had to escape before whatever this was followed me. But as I reached the lobby, I stopped dead in my tracks. The manager stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with that same terrified look. And then, finally, he spoke. "You shouldn't have gone back in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, my voice cracking. What is happening here? What was that thing in room 307? What did I see? The manager's face darkened. "You saw the thing that's been here long before this hotel was ever built. The thing that haunts this place. It's always here, always waiting. People come, they check in, but they never leave the same. They never come back whole." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me? I've tried. I've warned everyone who comes through, but they never listen. You were drawn here, just like the others. It's the hotel. It feeds on those who enter. It pulls them in, and once you're in, there's no way out. I stared at him, horrified. But I'm not staying here. I'm leaving, right now. I turned to go, but before I could take a step, I froze. The door that I had just come through was locked. No matter how hard I pulled on the handle, it wouldn't open. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin as I turned to look back at the manager, who was now standing motionless, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I didn't have to look to know what it was. I didn't have to see the shadow in the corner of the room. I could feel it. I could feel the presence closing in on me, just like it had before. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how hard I tried to run, there would always be a part of me that remained here, trapped in this hotel, in this place that was more than just a building. There was no escape. I couldn't leave, and neither could anyone else. As the darkness enveloped me, I realized that room 307 wasn't just a room. It was a doorway to something far worse than I could ever imagine. And once you passed through, you were never truly free. The hotel, now a dark, suffocating mass in my memory, continued to haunt my every thought. The image of room 307, that shadow on the wall, and the cold voice that whispered from within the walls had burned themselves into my mind, as though they were etched in some permanent ink I couldn't erase. I could never forget that night, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if the hotel had seeped into my very being, its darkness following me even in the light of day. I managed to leave the building, stumbling out into the cool night air, my heart still racing, my legs weak beneath me. But the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, something shifted. The world outside no longer felt the same. It was as if I was no longer a part of it. The air felt colder, the streetlights seemed dimmer, and the sounds of the city felt muffled, as though I was listening from behind a glass wall. I wasn't sure if it was the lingering effects of fear or something far worse, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was still with me. I didn't know what had happened to the manager. I never saw him again. I never saw anyone else who had been in the hotel that night. It was as though they had all vanished, erased from the world in the same way the hotel had erased me. It was clear now that whatever presence had inhabited that place, it was far more than just a haunting. It was a living, breathing entity that fed on the fear and confusion of those who entered, trapping them in its grip, never letting them leave. Months passed, and I tried to move on. I found a new place to live, started a new job, and filled my days with routine, hoping to drown out the memories. But the dreams came, uninvited and relentless. I would wake up in cold sweats, my heart pounding, hearing that voice again, that low, empty hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Sometimes I would wake up with a feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the dark corners of my room, waiting. And no matter how many times I turned the light on, no matter how many times I checked the corners, I knew that the presence was still there. I tried to tell myself that it was just a bad experience, a nightmarish thing I had gone through and survived. But deep down, I knew I hadn't survived. I hadn't really escaped. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something had followed me from that hotel. Something had slipped past the doors and into the real world, into my life. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, just like I had felt it in that room. The eyes, the presence, the cold weight of it pressing down on me. At times, I would find myself driving by that hotel, the same place I thought I had left behind. The neon sign still hung above the front entrance, though I could never be sure if the lights were on or off. The building seemed the same as I remembered it, old, tired, but still standing, though there was something about it now that filled me with an unbearable dread. I told myself I would never go near it again, that I would never set foot in that place, no matter how much the temptation to understand it, to learn what had really happened, gnawed at me. It was a place where things went wrong, a place where people disappeared, and in some strange way, I had already paid the price for my curiosity. One day, I came across an old article online, tucked away in the back of a forgotten forum. It was about the hotel, the same one where I had stayed. It had been written years ago, but as I read the words, I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl down my spine. The hotel had a dark history, one that no one seemed willing to speak of. It had been built on an old piece of land, one where strange occurrences had been reported long before the building even went up. The article spoke of unsolved disappearances, unexplained deaths, and rumors that no one dared to explore further. But the most chilling part came at the end, a detail so small it was almost overlooked. The hotel had never had a proper owner. At least, no one had ever been able to trace who had funded the construction or who ran it. All the records were either destroyed or mysteriously erased. The building itself was a shell, with no clear past, no foundation, no real explanation for why it stood there, in the middle of a bustling city. And according to the article, the building's location was rumored to be on top of something older, a forgotten structure that was rumored to be built long before even the town itself had existed. I couldn't help but wonder if I had stumbled onto something that was much bigger than I had ever realized. The hotel was never just a hotel after all. It had been a portal of sorts, a bridge between worlds, and once I had crossed into that darkness, there was no way to fully return. The only thing I had been able to do was walk away physically, at least, but I couldn't outrun the weight of what I had experienced. It would follow me, just as it had followed so many before me. That thought lingered in my mind, an uncomfortable truth that I couldn't shake. I had left the hotel behind, but it had never left me. Maybe I had been marked in some way. Maybe there were others out there, like me, who had left that place, but were still trapped in its shadow. I couldn't be sure. I didn't want to be sure. But the last time I passed by the hotel, it was different. The lights were all off. The windows were dark. And for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something in the window, a figure, barely visible, standing still and watching. My heart skipped a beat, and I drove away as fast as I could, the fear welling up in my chest again. The truth was clear to me now. No one truly leaves the hotel. They simply go somewhere else. And in the end, the hotel doesn't need to take you, it just has to make sure that you never forget it. And for the rest of my life, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. Hiking was more than a hobby for me. It was an escape. An escape from the noise of the world, from the routine of daily life. There was something about the stillness of the forest, the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots, that helped clear my mind. On that particular weekend, I decided to take a solo trip into the woods. It had been a while since I had ventured far enough to truly get lost. This was the kind of hike that required more than just a casual stroll. I was aiming for some time away from civilization, some time to just think. I had packed light, water, snacks, a few layers of clothing, and my trusted map and compass. The trail I chose was one I had walked before, but never beyond a certain point. The path was known for leading deep into the forest, far from any established campgrounds, but it always seemed like the perfect place for a peaceful retreat. The first few hours passed with nothing but the sound of my boots hitting the soft, damp earth. I took in the familiar scent of pine needles, the occasional chirp of a distant bird, and the low hum of the forest's natural rhythm. The farther I went, the more secluded the area became. Soon, there were no other hikers, no other sounds, just me and the woods. The isolation was refreshing, and I found myself letting go of the everyday stress that I had carried into the forest. I wasn't particularly worried about getting lost. I had my map, my compass, and the knowledge of the trail's general direction. I had done this before. The thing that was starting to bother me, though, was the silence. It was too quiet. No rustling of small animals, no wind through the trees, no distant bird calls. Just the sound of my own footsteps. As I continued along the trail, I noticed something strange. There was a feeling, a sensation that I couldn't shake off. It was like being watched. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the longer I walked, the more intense the sensation became. It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced before on my hikes. There was something off about this place. Something that made me second-guess every step I took. By the time the sun began to set, I had reached a part of the trail I had never explored before. The trees here were thick, their trunks twisted and knotted as if they had grown together in an eternal struggle for sunlight. The ground was soft, almost spongy, as though the earth had been untouched for centuries. I paused for a moment, standing in the middle of the trail, taking in my surroundings. I was far from any known trail markers, deep in the heart of the forest, and yet there was something that felt strangely familiar about the area. It was then that I noticed it just up ahead, partially obscured by the overgrowth, was a small, weathered cabin. It wasn't on my map, and I had never heard anyone mention it before. The cabin seemed out of place, almost like it didn't belong in this part of the forest. Its roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the windows were covered in grime, leaving only a hint of light filtering through the cracks. The door, hanging crooked on its hinges, looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. There was no sign of life, no smoke rising from a chimney, no footprints in the dirt. It was as if the cabin had been abandoned long ago, left to rot away in the wilderness. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. It didn't make sense to be this far from the main trail without any signs of other hikers, and yet here was the cabin, its presence inexplicable. As I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that the woods themselves were waiting for something to happen. I reached the front door and gave it a push, but it didn't open. I had to shoulder it, and with a loud creak, it finally swung open, revealing the interior, a dark, dust-choked room. The floor was covered in leaves, the furniture coated in years of filth, and everything had that musty, decaying smell that comes with abandonment. There was no one inside, no signs of recent activity, just the eerie stillness of a place left to fall apart. It didn't make sense, and as I stepped inside, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was almost as if the cabin itself was aware of my presence. as though the very walls were listening to my every move. I tried to push the unsettling feeling out of my mind. I was just exploring, just taking in the quiet of this old, forgotten cabin. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong about this place, something I couldn't yet understand. The silence, the isolation, and the eerie atmosphere of the cabin all came together in a way that didn't sit right with me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest into shadow, I began to feel a growing unease. There was no sign of anyone else, no sound, just the relentless presence of the woods pressing in around me. For the first time on this hike, I felt the need to leave to get out of that cabin and back onto the trail. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a faint movement in one of the cabin's windows, just beyond my line of sight. My heart skipped a beat. The feeling of being watched had never been more intense, and I couldn't shake the idea that I wasn't alone anymore. I stood frozen, waiting for the sound of footsteps, the rustling of leaves, anything that would explain what I had just seen. But the woods remained still. Everything was silent. And yet, the feeling of dread settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and unshakable. For a moment, I thought about turning back and hiking out of the woods, but a strange compulsion kept me rooted to that spot. Something told me I had to stay, that I had to figure out what was happening here. But what was happening? What was the source of this unrelenting feeling of fear? I didn't know then, but I was about to find out. The stillness inside the cabin was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of rot, dust, and old wood. Every corner seemed to have its own hidden secrets, and the more I looked, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't understand. At first, I thought I might have imagined the movement I'd seen in the window. It was too fleeting, too subtle to be certain. But there was again something shifting behind the grime-covered glass. My heart began to race, a tight knot forming in my stomach. Was it a person? An animal? Or was it just the wind, playing tricks with the cabin's decaying structure? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This was ridiculous. I had hiked through the woods countless times before, and I had encountered nothing more dangerous than a startled deer or a curious squirrel. Why was I letting my imagination run wild now? The logical part of me told me to leave, to walk back to the trail and forget all about this cabin. But my curiosity overpowered the feeling of unease that was creeping through my body. I stepped cautiously toward the window, my shoes crunching on the debris scattered across the floor. The heavy wooden beams above creaked, and I flinched, suddenly aware of how old and unstable this place was. The window was small, barely wide enough to peer through, and it was covered in layers of dirt and grime. I wiped a hand across the glass, trying to get a better view, but all I could see were vague shapes in the shadows. The forest outside was darkening rapidly as the last bits of daylight disappeared behind the horizon. I pressed my face closer, straining my eyes, trying to discern any movement. My breath fogged up the glass, but when it cleared, I thought I saw something, just a brief flicker of motion, something that didn't belong. It was quick, so quick that I almost doubted what I had seen. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. Was it a reflection? Or was there someone out there? The forest was growing darker, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther into the woods. I glanced toward the door, then back to the window. I considered leaving the cabin, stepping back into the growing night, but my feet remained rooted to the spot. A sense of dread filled me, and I had to fight the impulse to flee. Instead, I turned back to the room, searching for something to reassure me. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my own overactive imagination. I decided to explore the cabin further, to see if there was anything that might explain why I felt so out of place here. I needed to ground myself, to find something concrete, something that made sense in this strange situation. I moved to the far side of the cabin, where a small, rusted stove sat against the wall. Its surface was covered in dust, and the once bright metal had dulled with age. There was a small table nearby, its legs crooked, and a stack of old newspapers sat on the floor beside it. The papers were yellowed with time, their edges curling up as if they had been left untouched for years. I reached down, my fingers brushing over the brittle paper, and picked up one of the newspapers. The headline, barely legible through the decay, read, "Local search efforts fail. Missing hikers case cold." The date was over a decade old. A chill ran through me. Missing hikers? Was this cabin connected to something from the past? Had someone else been here before, and had they disappeared in the same strange way I was beginning to feel? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. The paper was old, but there was something about it, something that made me feel like I wasn't the first person to be drawn to this cabin. I stood there for a moment, holding the newspaper, and then I heard a faint sound, like the creak of a floorboard somewhere in the distance. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze, the paper slipping from my hand and fluttering to the floor. My heart was pounding now, and my eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of movement. The sound had come from above, from the second floor. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with dread. There was no second floor in this cabin. The place was small, dilapidated, a single room with no staircase or upstairs. I turned slowly, my eyes darting to the ceiling. The wooden beam stretched across the cabin, and nothing appeared to be out of place. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was stronger now than it had been before. I moved toward the door, hesitated, and then stepped outside, hoping to clear my head. The evening air was cool against my skin, and the forest was silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. There was no logical explanation for what I had just heard. It had to have been my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after hours of solitude. But the more I stood there, the more I felt a sense of unease clawing at my chest. As I looked out at the darkening woods, I felt as though the forest itself was waiting, holding its breath. I wasn't alone here. I could feel it. It wasn't until I heard the sound again, a low thud, followed by the unmistakable creak of floorboards, that I realized how foolish I had been. I wasn't alone in that cabin, and whatever was making those sounds was no figment of my imagination. Panic surged through me, and I ran back toward the door, pulling it open with more force than necessary. I didn't care about the strange noises anymore. I didn't care about the cabin. I needed to leave. But as I stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat, I froze. There, standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the cabin's fading light, was a figure. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, and unmoving. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no distinguishing features, but it was there, standing still, watching me. My legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in mud, and I couldn't bring myself to move. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, waiting. I called out, my voice trembling, but the figure didn't respond. And then, in a split second, it was gone, vanished into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. But the woods were silent, the figure nowhere to be seen. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to process what had just happened. What was that thing? Who had it been? And what did it want with me? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out of there. Something was wrong with this place, something I couldn't understand, and I wasn't about to stick around long enough to find out what it was. But as I turned to leave, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, and heavy, stopped me in my tracks. My breath hitched, my blood ran cold. There was no one there. I was alone, or so I thought. And that's when I realized the truth. I hadn't just stumbled upon an abandoned cabin in the woods. I had walked straight into something much darker. The days had passed slowly since the night in the cabin, each one more unsettling than the last. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just the result of too much isolation, too much time spent alone in the woods, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That figure I had seen at the edge of the forest haunted me every waking moment. It wasn't the first time I had felt the presence of something watching me, but it was the first time I'd felt so certain about it. I spent the following days trying to keep my mind occupied, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of unease that seemed to follow me everywhere I went. But it was impossible to forget. The cabin, the noises, the figure in the woods, it all weighed heavily on my mind. And soon, it started to feel as though the very air around me was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't leave. There was something that kept pulling me back to that cabin, something I couldn't quite explain. Despite the terror I felt, a strange curiosity began to take root, pushing me to return, to learn more, to understand what had happened in that place. On the fourth day, I ventured back to the cabin. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife seemingly absent. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the trees still and silent, as if holding their breath. I walked through the overgrown path, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cabin loomed ahead, its weathered exterior casting long shadows under the midday sun. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The memory of the figure standing just beyond the trees was fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me inside. But I pushed the thought aside. I had come this far. I couldn't turn back now. The door creaked as I pushed it open, its hinges groaning in protest. The smell of mildew and decay hit me immediately, and I fought the urge to gag. The inside of the cabin looked exactly as I had left it, dusty, dilapidated, and forgotten. But it felt different now, more oppressive, as if the space itself was alive, aware of my presence. I stood in the middle of the room, taking in the scene. The wooden beams above were low, and the floorboards beneath me creaked with each movement. The air was thick and stale, carrying a sense of abandonment, yet there was a tension in it, an energy I couldn't explain. My eyes drifted to the window where I had seen the movement before. The glass was still dirty, but now I thought I could make out faint smudges, like someone had pressed their hand against it from the outside. I froze, my blood running cold. The smudges were fresh. I had wiped the glass clean just days ago. How could they have reappeared? I stepped closer, my heartbeat pounding in my chest, and reached out to touch the glass. The temperature was noticeably cooler than the air around it, as though it had been touched recently. I pulled my hand back quickly, my mind racing. Who had been here? And why hadn't I noticed anything when I left? The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in here with me. I turned away from the window and glanced around the cabin, looking for anything out of place. The table, the old stove, the scattered newspapers, they were all exactly where I had left them. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. The silence felt oppressive, and the darkness in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I took a step toward the back door, wanting to leave, but then I heard it again, the faint creak of floorboards from above. I turned sharply, my breath caught in my throat. There it was again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was coming from the second floor. But there was no second floor. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The cabin didn't have an upstairs, not in the way a normal house would. I had checked, looked around for a way to get up there, but it was just one flat room. I had assumed the sounds were just the house settling, the old wood groaning under its own weight, but now I wasn't so sure. I took another cautious step forward, moving toward the trapdoor in the corner that led down to the basement. The noise seemed to be coming from above, but the basement was the only part of the house that was truly below me. As I stood over the trapdoor, I hesitated. Should I investigate? Or should I leave this place behind once and for all? But something pulled me forward, a need for answers I couldn't ignore. I reached down and pulled open the trapdoor, the wooden boards creaking loudly in the silence. The basement below was shrouded in darkness, the faint scent of damp earth rising up to meet me. I hesitated for only a moment before I climbed down, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air down here was colder, thick with the musty scent of mold and rot. I stood still for a moment, my eyes adjusting to the lack of light. The basement was small, cramped, with shelves lined with forgotten jars and bottles. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak yellow glow over the room. I stepped deeper into the basement, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The silence down here was absolute, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. I moved toward the far wall, where a small workbench sat covered in dust. A few old tools lay scattered on top, and beneath the workbench, I noticed something strange, an old wooden crate, barely visible in the shadows. I crouched down, my fingers brushing the rough edges of the crate, and pulled it out into the light. It was heavier than it should have been, and I couldn't help but wonder what it might contain. My curiosity pushed me to open it, and as I lifted the lid, a chill ran through my spine. Inside the crate were old, faded photographs, dozens of them. Some were torn at the edges, others warped with age. They were all of the same cabin, the same forest, but the faces of the people in the photos were obscured, blurred by time or damage. I sifted through the photos, my hands trembling as I turned each one over. And then I found it. One photo, in particular, stood out. It was a picture of the cabin, taken from the very spot where I stood, but there was something off about it. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, its features obscured by darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't just a trick of the light. That figure was real, and it had been here. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I looked at the photo. Was this what had been haunting me all along? Suddenly, I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above. I froze, my blood running cold. Someone or something was in the cabin with me. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I stood up quickly, dropping the photo, and back toward the stairs. I had to get out of here. There was no question about it anymore. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I froze in place. Standing in the doorway of the cabin was the same figure from the photo, the shadowy silhouette, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I didn't think, I just ran. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, each breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure, the same shadowy presence I had seen in the photographs and felt in my bones, was standing in the doorway. Its form was indistinct, like a black silhouette against the dim light of the cabin, but its presence was undeniable. I didn't know who or what it was, but I knew that I couldn't stay to find out. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked as I made my way toward the front door. My hands shook violently as I grabbed the handle, but when I yanked it open, I found myself staring into the thick, impenetrable darkness of the woods. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. There was no sign of the figure anymore, no movement at all, just the haunting quiet of the night. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I turned and bolted into the woods, the leaves crunching beneath my feet, the sounds of my hurried steps masking the pounding of my heart. Every part of me screamed to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. I don't know how long I ran. My legs were burning, my muscles screaming in protest, but I couldn't slow down. Every shadow seemed to hold something more sinister than the last. The trees around me pressed closer, their gnarled branches seeming to reach out and grab at me as if the forest itself was trying to trap me. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. But that feeling, that sense of being watched, never left me. I could feel the presence, the weight of something following, just out of sight, keeping pace with me in the dark. I pushed harder, my breath ragged, my eyes stinging from the effort, but there was nowhere to go. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I pushed myself, the woods never seemed to end. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the distance. But these were different. They were heavier, slower, more deliberate, and they were getting closer. Panic surged through me, my body shaking with terror as I turned a corner in the forest and stumbled into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, the stones cracked and overgrown with vines. I had no idea how I had gotten here. The cabin was far behind me, but something told me that I had not yet escaped whatever was following me. I didn't stop. I kept running, my eyes wide with fear as I glanced over my shoulder. But the moment I looked forward again, I froze. The figure was standing in the clearing, right in front of me, its silhouette barely discernible in the moonlight. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of it. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move. It simply stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. And then something shifted. The darkness around the figure seemed to twist, warping in a way that defied logic. The shadows deepened, and I could feel something unnatural, something wrong radiating from it. My body wanted to scream, to run, but my voice wouldn't come. My legs wouldn't cooperate. The figure's shape began to shift, becoming more distinct, more solid. The darkness around it seemed to take form, its edges sharp and jagged, like the figure was a part of the very night itself. I could hear a low, guttural sound now, like whispers carried on the wind, but there was no one else around. The only sound was the thudding of my own heartbeat, growing louder and louder in my ears. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that reverberated deep inside my skull. It was a sound that wasn't so much heard as felt, a vibration that echoed through my bones. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was low, almost mocking, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I didn't understand. I didn't know what was happening. But something deep inside me, something primal and terrified, understood. This wasn't just some figure in the woods. This wasn't some lost soul or wandering spirit. This was something older. Something that had been here long before the cabin, long before I ever set foot in these woods. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the uneven ground, and I fell hard onto the cold earth. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its presence suffocating, its gaze locked onto mine as if it were waiting for something. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. The whispers, the low rumblings, grew louder and louder, filling my mind with a maddening pressure. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air lifted, leaving only silence in its wake. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling, my mind reeling. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. Was it real? Had it been some hallucination? Or was I just losing my mind? I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay in that place any longer. My body moved on its own, forcing me to my feet as I stumbled back through the forest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran. I didn't stop until I found myself back at the edge of the woods, the familiar sight of my car waiting for me in the distance. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, my breath still ragged from the terror I had just experienced. When I finally got in the car, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it instinctively. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the woods, my mind still racing. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty. But the words it had spoken, they lingered in my mind. You shouldn't have come back. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know why I had come back. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going back to that cabin. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness of the car, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. The words from the figure, the shadowy form that had emerged from the depths of the forest, each thought seemed to blur with the next, leaving me in a whirlwind of confusion and terror. But what truly haunted me was the question that gnawed at my mind. What was it? I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of everything. But the more I thought, the less clear it became. It didn't feel like a normal encounter with something supernatural. There had been no warnings, no clear signs that I had wandered into something dangerous. I hadn't heard of any ghost stories or legends surrounding the area. Yet, there it was, this presence, this thing, standing before me like it had been waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of sitting frozen, I started the car. The engine sputtered to life, and the headlights illuminated the path back through the woods, my escape route. I wasn't sure where I was going, whether I was fleeing or simply trying to get far enough away to convince myself that the nightmare I had experienced wasn't real. I left the woods behind, driving down the winding road, the weight of the forest lifting off my chest with every mile. But even as I distanced myself from that place, the questions didn't stop. They kept circling, like vultures picking at a carcass. Why was that figure there? What had it meant by, "You shouldn't have come back"? I had no answers, only more doubts. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. At work, I stared blankly at my computer screen, unable to concentrate on the tasks in front of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in the safety of my own apartment. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling sound outside my window sent me into a panic, a flash of that shadow returning to mind. But as time passed, I tried to push it all away. I tried to convince myself that what had happened in the woods had been a nightmare, some figment of my imagination fueled by the isolation of the cabin and the dark, unsettling atmosphere of the woods. Perhaps I had let my fear get the best of me. Yet, even as I tried to bury the memory, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn back to that place. I felt as though the forest hadn't released me, that whatever that presence had been was still lingering, waiting for me to return. I spent the next few weeks researching the area, combing through local news and historical records. I couldn't find anything that seemed relevant at first, no disappearances, no strange occurrences. But then, buried deep in a forgotten local archive, I came across something that chilled me to my core. It was an old article, dated back nearly a century, about a man who had built a cabin in the very woods I had visited. His name was James Willoughby. The article described how he had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a trail of blood and a sense of unease among the townspeople. No one ever found out what happened to him, but the article ended with a cryptic sentence. Some say he was taken by the forest itself, and that he now waits for those who dare enter his domain. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Could this be the same figure that I had encountered? Was it possible that James Willoughby had somehow become part of the forest, trapped in some twisted form of existence, awaiting anyone foolish enough to return? I couldn't say for sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to him, whatever had happened to me, wasn't over. I had left the woods, yes, but the woods hadn't left me. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to return to some semblance of normal. But the memories of the cabin, the figure, and the forest kept resurfacing, like flashes in the dark. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped enjoying the things I used to. That eerie feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, lingered like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. I tried to forget about it all. I went on with my life, as best as I could, but there was a constant, quiet dread in the back of my mind, a fear that something was waiting for me just beyond the horizon. One night, about a month after my encounter, I received an unexpected call. It was from a friend, someone I had known for years, but hadn't spoken to in a while. He was planning a trip to the same area I had visited, the same forest, the same cabin, and wanted to know if I'd like to join. I froze. My heart began to race, my breath quickening. The thought of going back to that place, of stepping foot into the woods again, filled me with dread. I told him no. I told him it was a bad idea, that it wasn't safe, and that he should stay away. He seemed confused, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the figure, the whispers, and the overwhelming feeling that something dark was waiting. A week passed, and I heard nothing more about it. My friend had stopped calling, stopped messaging, and I began to convince myself that I had done the right thing. But then, one morning, I woke up to a message on my phone from an unknown number. The text was simple, only a few words, but it was enough to send ice through my veins. I made it to the cabin. Everything's fine. Don't worry about me. But I saw something. It's just like you said. I didn't reply. Instead, I grabbed my car keys, my breath coming fast and shallow, and rushed out the door. I didn't know why I was driving back to that place. Perhaps I was trying to prove that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't losing my mind to fear. But as I sped toward the forest, the weight of the past few weeks hit me. I realized that I had never truly escaped. I arrived at the edge of the woods, the familiar twisted trees looming in the distance. I parked the car and sat there for a long moment, staring at the forest, the shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it all again. But one thing was certain: I was not going into that forest alone. The woods were silent, but the silence was never peaceful. It was as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I sat in my car for what seemed like hours, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. Despite the calm appearance, I knew better. I knew there was something in there. Something watching. Something waiting. The message from my friend echoed in my mind. I saw something. It's just like you said. The words were still fresh, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. What had he seen? What did he mean? I wasn't sure. I wanted to find out. But despite the fear gripping my chest, I knew I couldn't just drive away again. I couldn't let whatever was haunting these woods claim another person. I had to know what was really going on, whether it was a curse, a ghost, or something even worse. I had heard about the idea of cursed places, locations that seemed to draw people in, trapping them in some kind of endless loop, forcing them to confront their worst fears. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Perhaps the forest itself was cursed, its roots twisted deep into the earth, feeding off the fears and souls of anyone who entered. It would explain the unnerving pull I had felt even after leaving. It would explain why I had returned despite every instinct telling me to stay away. But now, I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing by going back. I had no intention of entering the woods alone, so I sent out a quick message to a friend, a good friend, someone who had always been supportive, even if he had his own reservations about my recent behavior. He didn't respond immediately, but I had no time to waste. This wasn't something that could be postponed. The woods, the figure, the eerie presence, I knew it wasn't just going to let me go. I had to face it head on. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. He was on his way, saying he'd be there soon. I felt a slight sense of relief, but the gnawing fear remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was drawing me in again. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until it had taken what it wanted. As the minutes turned to hours, I grew restless. The darkness began to close in around me. The trees, towering over me like silent sentinels, seemed to stretch even higher as the evening light waned. The wind rustled through the branches, almost too quiet, as if trying to mask something hidden in the shadows. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. I recognized him immediately. It was my friend. I got out of the car quickly, relief flooding my chest. But that relief was short-lived. As he got closer, I saw the look in his eyes. The same blank, distant stare that I had seen in the mirror every day since the night of the encounter. It was a look of someone who had seen something they could never unsee. His face was pale, his movements stiff. "Are you all right?" I asked, but the words came out hollow, like I already knew the answer. He didn't speak right away. He stood there, staring at the ground, as if trying to collect himself. Then, finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it. It's not just a ghost, man. It's something worse, something more real than we can understand. It's alive." His words were a punch to the gut. I had suspected something like this, but hearing him say it out loud sent a shockwave of terror through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. I went inside the cabin. I thought maybe there was something in there that could explain it. Something that could give us answers, he said, his voice trembling. But when I stepped inside, I saw it. I didn't even know what it was at first. It was just a shadow. But then it started to take shape. It wasn't human, but it had a face. A twisted, horrible face. It stared at me, and I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. His voice broke, and I could see the fear in his eyes. The same fear I had felt. It wanted me. It wanted all of us. I think it's been waiting for someone to come back. A cold dread settled over me, and I felt as though the ground beneath me was shifting. His words hit too close to the truth. This wasn't just some random encounter. It wasn't something that could be brushed off as a figment of imagination. The entity in the woods, the presence that had haunted me from the beginning, it was real. It was hungry. We stood there, staring at each other in the silence, the weight of our shared fear hanging heavily in the air. The woods loomed before us, dark and silent, as though they were daring us to enter. But something had changed. I had to leave. I had to get out, to run as far from that place as possible. Without another word, we turned and headed back to the car. The sense of urgency in our steps made everything feel too real. But as we walked, I could feel the pull of the woods behind me, almost as if the trees were reaching out to drag me back in. I felt its presence again, closer this time, pressing against me. We didn't look back. The drive home was quiet. We both knew that whatever had happened in that forest would never truly leave us. The forest had claimed something in us. It had marked us, and no matter where we went, it would follow. The cabin in the woods remained, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon it, waiting for someone to make the mistake of venturing too close, too curious to turn away. It was a chilly evening in late autumn when I first arrived at the remote forest, tucked away miles from civilization. The kind of forest where the trees stand tall, their ancient roots snaking deep into the earth, and the silence feels almost unnatural. I had just been promoted to park ranger, a job that was supposed to be quiet, uneventful, and peaceful. I'd always been the type of guy who enjoyed the solitude, so when the opportunity came up, I jumped at the chance to work in the wilderness. This particular forest was vast, untouched, and so remote that most people didn't even bother to visit. The kind of place you might stumble upon if you were lost, but few actually sought out. I had a partner, Ryan, but he had been away on a training mission for the past week. I had spent the first few days settling into the ranger's cabin, which was tucked into the woods at the edge of the park. The cabin was simple, not much more than a cozy place to sleep and eat after a long day of patrolling the park. The work itself was routine, checking the trails, making sure no hikers had gotten lost, and ensuring the wildlife was undisturbed. It was peaceful, just as I had imagined. The nights, however, were a different story. The forest felt different at night. The darkness wasn't like the city darkness, where streetlights softened the edges of the night. Here, in the woods, the darkness was thick. It seemed to swallow everything, every sound, every movement. I was used to it after a few days, but there were moments when the isolation gnawed me. The isolation and the eeriness of it all. Still, I didn't think much of it. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. I'd been alone in the woods before, but something about this place felt different. On the morning of the incident, the sun was barely rising, and the fog had settled in thick around the trees. I had just finished my coffee and was getting ready for my morning rounds when I heard it. It wasn't a sound that I recognized, at least not immediately. It was a distant thudding, like a heavy object being dropped onto the forest floor. Now, I'd heard plenty of noises in the woods before, branches cracking under the weight of animals, the rustling of leaves, the occasional howl of a coyote. But this was different. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I shrugged it off at first, assuming it was just a tree limb falling, but something about it felt off. Still, I continued with my rounds, making my way along the trail to check on some of the park's usual visitors, the deer, the foxes, and the occasional bobcat. By noon, I had grown accustomed to the eerie quiet of the forest again. It was just another day in the life of a park ranger. The weather was cool, but not unbearable, and the sky was overcast. I had finished my morning rounds and was making my way back to the cabin when I noticed something strange. A series of small footprints, too large to be from any of the animals I was familiar with, crisscrossed the path I was walking on. They were fresh, maybe only a few hours old, but they were unlike anything I had ever seen before. I knelt down to inspect them, noticing how wide they were, almost too wide to belong to anything native to these parts. They didn't belong to a bear, a coyote, or anything I had learned about in my training. My first instinct was to call Ryan, but he was still away, and I hadn't received any news from him in days. The thought of going deeper into the forest alone wasn't exactly comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about these tracks. The trees around me stood tall and still, but the more I stared at those footprints, the more I felt like something was watching me. I stood up slowly and continued walking back toward the cabin. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I was being followed, but when I looked, there was nothing. Just the same quiet forest stretching out into the distance. I laughed it off, trying to push the uneasy feeling from my mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The sun began to set early that evening, and the eerie quiet returned. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the cabin and preparing for the night shift, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig seemed to be amplified in the silence. That night, as I sat by the fire in the cabin, I heard it again, the sound of something heavy hitting the forest floor. This time, it was much closer. My heart began to race, and I grabbed the flashlight from the table. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the flickering orange glow of the fire. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a fallen branch, but deep down, I knew better. There was something in the woods that didn't belong there, and it was close. Very close. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the hours watching the dark forest through the cabin window, waiting for anything out of the ordinary. The thudding sounds continued at irregular intervals, echoing through the trees, but I didn't dare venture outside. Not yet. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and as dawn finally broke, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Something was happening in those woods, and I was beginning to fear I was right in the middle of it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would investigate further. The morning after that sleepless night, I felt a strange sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. The sun had barely risen, and the chill in the air was sharp, more like winter than autumn. The fog had lifted, but the forest still felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. I stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long time, staring out at the trees. Something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the forest felt off. The usual sounds of birds and squirrels were missing, and the silence was deafening. It was as if the entire forest had been hushed. I couldn't shake the thought that something had changed, something I hadn't noticed before. I was used to the forest's moods, but today felt different. I told myself it was nothing, just the exhaustion of a long night, the isolation getting to me, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the crisp air biting at my skin as I walked down the porch steps. I could still hear the lingering echoes of the strange thudding noises from the night before. My mind raced as I thought back to the footprints I had seen. The more I considered them, the more uneasy I felt. They weren't animal tracks, and they weren't from any creature I could recognize. They were too wide, too deliberate. I decided to head out on my rounds, hoping that a little physical activity would clear my head. The usual patrol was uneventful, checking the trails, inspecting the markers, and scanning for signs of trespassers or injured wildlife. But as I made my way deeper into the forest, I began to notice things that weren't quite right. First, I noticed the trees. They seemed to be in slightly different positions than the day before. Now, I'm no expert in forestry, but it was hard to ignore the subtle changes. Some branches seemed bent at odd angles, others cracked and hanging unnaturally low, as though something had pushed them aside. But the strangest part was that there was no sign of any animals. No birds flitting through the branches, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. I paused by a clearing, scanning the area for any signs of life. That's when I saw a tree, half uprooted, lying sideways across the trail. The ground around it was torn up, as though something large had moved through the area. It didn't make sense. No storm had passed through, and no heavy machinery had been in the area. The tree had simply been shoved aside, the earth beneath it disturbed. My heart began to race, and I felt that familiar prickle of fear run up my spine. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. Maybe a large animal had knocked the tree over in its search for food, I thought. But the more I looked at it, the less plausible that seemed. The force it would have taken to uproot that tree was immense, far beyond what any animal in this area could muster. I bent down to inspect the ground around the tree, and that's when I noticed something. Another set of footprints, but these were different from the ones I had seen the day before. They were deeper, more pronounced, and they led straight into the forest, toward the heart of the woods. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but something compelled me to follow them. I kept a cautious distance, trying to keep my breathing steady, my flashlight in hand. The further I went, the more uncomfortable I felt. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching like long fingers. Every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart jump. It was like the woods themselves were alive, watching me, reacting to my every movement. The footprints led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, a pile of broken branches and twigs in the center of the clearing, stacked haphazardly, like something had been hiding there. I stepped closer, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. There, beneath the pile of debris, was an object. I bent down to get a closer look, my hands trembling slightly. It was a small, rusted piece of metal, maybe a discarded part of an old vehicle or machinery. But it didn't belong here. This was a remote forest, miles away from the nearest road or settlement. There was no reason for a piece of metal like this to be lying around. My heart raced. I stood up quickly, my mind reeling. My gut told me to get out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned sharply, scanning the trees. There was nothing. Nothing but the endless stretch of forest. I felt a rush of cold air hit my face, and I shivered. The silence was overwhelming, oppressive, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, as I started to back away, something caught my eye. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, moving swiftly between the trees. I froze. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I tried to focus on the movement. But it was gone, vanished into the dense forest. I was sure I had seen someone, but there was no trace of them. No footprints, no rustling of leaves, nothing. I ran back to the cabin without looking back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen or thought I had seen. Had it been a person, or was it something else? A sense of dread clung to me, and the further I walked, the more the weight of the forest pressed in on me. Back at the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the small table. I tried to calm myself, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't explain what had happened out there, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, but they lingered, festering in the back of my thoughts. Whatever I had seen or thought I had seen wasn't normal, and whatever had been going on in this forest was only just beginning to reveal itself. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep inside me, and it only grew worse as time went on. I tried to carry on with my routine, checking the trails, inspecting the perimeter of the park, making sure everything was in order, but the oddities continued. They became more frequent, more inescapable. One morning, I woke up to a low, unnatural hum filling the air, a sound I couldn't place. It was like an engine idling in the distance, but there were no roads for miles around. The sound would rise and fall in waves, almost like it was following me. I would walk to the far side of the cabin, and it would be faint. But as soon as I turned back, it would swell up again, closer than before. It was maddening. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my nerves. Maybe it was the wind or the distant sound of a generator. But the hum didn't stop. It persisted through the day and night, like some relentless background noise that wouldn't leave me in peace. It was on the third night that things escalated. I had just finished my rounds and was making my way back to the cabin when I heard footsteps. Light at first, barely audible, but growing closer. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The sound wasn't like the usual rustling of animals in the forest. These footsteps were too deliberate, too controlled. They were paced, and they were moving toward me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the usual shadowy silhouettes of the trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. My pulse was racing, and I stood there for several long seconds, staring into the dark. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't. Instead, I waited, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees. But there was nothing. The footsteps had stopped as suddenly as they had started. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I made my way back to the cabin as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The sound of my own breathing was the only thing that seemed real. The following day, I decided to go back to the clearing with the uprooted tree, hoping to find some kind of explanation for the strange events. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. The air felt thick, charged with a sense of foreboding. I walked cautiously toward the site, my flashlight sweeping the area. The ground was still disturbed, the trees still lying sideways across the trail. But something was different. The pile of debris in the center of the clearing was gone, as though it had been moved or taken. The ground around it was freshly disturbed, and there were no longer any signs of the strange footprints I had seen earlier. I crouched down, running my fingers through the dirt, trying to find any trace of what had happened. But there was nothing, just an empty, hollow silence that seemed to echo off the trees. I stood up, my mind racing. What could have moved the pile of branches? What could have made those strange prints vanish without a trace? I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't notice the movement at first. Something shifted in the trees just beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, a figure darting between the trunks. It was quick, too quick for a person. It was as though the shape was a shadow, stretching unnaturally long before vanishing into the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding. I raised the flashlight again, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the rustling of the leaves and the wind whistling through the trees. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and left the clearing, my feet barely touching the ground as I hurried back to the cabin. But the eerie feeling stayed with me, like a cold hand gripping my chest. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong here, something was out of place, and I had to figure out what. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. At night, I would hear the faint hum again, always just on the edge of hearing, but never quite loud enough to pinpoint. And then there were the shadows. No matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight. In the corner of my vision, I would catch glimpses of figures darting between the trees, or I would hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind me, only to turn around and find nothing. I began to follow the shadows. Every time I thought I saw something move, I would stop and scan the area. Sometimes I would find nothing at all, but other times I would find signs, broken twigs, crushed leaves, as though something had passed through. Then came the most unsettling event of all. It was late one evening, and I had just finished my patrol. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in a dim twilight glow. I was walking back to the cabin when I saw a flicker of light in the distance. At first, I thought it was a fire, but it didn't behave like a fire. The light danced and flickered erratically, moving in a way that didn't seem natural. Curiosity pushed me forward. I walked toward the light, each step heavy with hesitation. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, but it remained distant, never quite coming any closer. It was almost as if the light was moving away from me, teasing me, drawing me deeper into the forest. The forest around me felt eerily still. The usual sounds of animals were absent, and the air was thick with silence. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter, then dimming, like a heartbeat. I reached the edge of a small ravine, and that's when I saw it, the source of the light. A figure, cloaked in a shimmering, pale glow, standing at the edge of the ravine, staring down into the darkness. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. It just stood there, completely still, its features obscured by the light. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze cold, piercing on me. I didn't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. The light flickered again, and the figure seemed to vanish into the shadows, leaving only the faint glow behind. I took a step forward, but my legs were unsteady, and the ground beneath me felt like it was shifting. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, and I knew deep down I wasn't alone. I ran. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, the sound of my own footsteps thundering in my ears, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, where I slammed the door behind me and bolted it shut. The forest outside felt suffocating, as though it was closing in on me. My mind raced, my thoughts scrambled, but one thing was certain: I was being hunted. Something in those woods was after me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. The days following my last encounter were a blur of fear and confusion. Each moment felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was pressing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hunting me. That figure, that light, whatever it had been, had left an indelible mark on my mind. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend like I was just imagining things. Something was in those woods, something old and wrong, and it was getting closer. I hadn't been able to sleep for days, and the moments I managed to rest were filled with nightmares. I would dream of the figure in the light, standing just out of reach, staring at me with its unblinking gaze. In my dreams, it would follow me through the woods, its shadow stretching impossibly long as it got closer and closer. I would run, but my legs were made of lead, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape. I spent my days pacing around the cabin, my nerves frayed, my mind on the edge. I couldn't keep up the act of pretending everything was normal. I couldn't ignore the fact that the park was no longer the sanctuary it had once been. I had to know what was out there. I had to face it. And that's when I made the decision. I was going to go back to the ravine. I had to see for myself. I had to face whatever it was that had been stalking me, and maybe, just maybe, I could put an end to it. There was no other choice. The unease, the fear, the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, it had to be dealt with. The sun was setting as I grabbed my gear. I packed a flashlight, a few supplies, and a weapon, just in case. I felt a twinge of disbelief in my own actions. Here I was, a park ranger, someone who had spent most of his life in the wilderness, preparing to confront something that I couldn't even understand. But there was no turning back now. The walk to the ravine was long and treacherous. The once familiar path had grown unnervingly unfamiliar in the last few days. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees pressing together like a wall, blocking out the light. The quiet was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, loud in my ears, but there was nothing else. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing to suggest that life was still going on as usual. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I neared the ravine, the temperature dropped, and a chill ran down my spine. I knew, deep down, that I was walking into something I couldn't control. But I had come this far. I had to see it through. I reached the edge of the ravine and stood there for a long time, scanning the area. There was no flickering light, no figure standing in the shadows. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of relief, but it was short-lived. The forest was eerily still, the quiet almost deafening. It was as though everything had stopped moving, holding its breath in anticipation. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint glow, like a distant star, hovering just above the ground. It was dim at first, but it grew brighter as I watched, pulsing like a heartbeat. It was the same light I had seen before, but this time it was different. It didn't flicker or fade. It was steady, almost alive, and it was moving toward me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the light. It moved slowly at first, but as it came closer, it began to speed up, growing larger, more defined, until it was no longer just a light. The figure emerged from the glow, its form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. It was taller than any human could be, and it was draped in a tattered, glowing cloak. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, staring right into my soul. I couldn't see its features, but I knew that it was watching me with a cold, calculating gaze. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me as the light continued to pulse around it. My mind raced. This wasn't just some figment of my imagination. This was real. This was happening. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. My voice was strangled, hoarse, as though I had forgotten how to use it. I wanted to scream, to ask what it wanted, but I couldn't find the words. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, the light around it growing brighter, more intense. And then, without warning, the light flared up, blinding me. I threw my arms up instinctively, shielding my eyes, but the light burned through my skin, searing into my very soul. The pain was unbearable, like I was being torn apart from the inside out. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, unable to see or think or move. The light consumed everything. I don't know how long I was on the ground, but when I finally opened my eyes, the light was gone. The figure was gone. The ravine was empty, and the forest was silent once again. My body was trembling, my heart racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest had become different. I didn't wait to see what else might happen. I stumbled to my feet and ran. I ran through the trees, through the underbrush, not caring about the branches that scratched at my face or the rocks that tripped me up. I just needed to get away. I needed to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had long set, and the forest was blanketed in darkness. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was racing, my thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and fear. I didn't know what I had seen or why it had come after me. But I knew one thing for certain. The forest was not what it seemed. There was something in those woods, something old and terrible, and it was watching, waiting for the next person foolish enough to cross its path. The night dragged on in agonizing silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even within the walls of the cabin. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. My mind raced through the events of the evening, replaying each moment over and over in an attempt to make sense of what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. The figure, the light, the pain, the burning intensity of it all. It wasn't something I could explain, and I knew deep down that I would never truly understand. What was that thing? Was it a spirit? A manifestation of the forest's ancient power? Or was it something else entirely, something far worse, that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? The questions gnawed at me, each one more unsettling than the last. I had barely slept at all, my thoughts plagued by images of the glowing figure, standing silently in the ravine, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. I kept seeing its eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that seemed to know everything about me, everything I'd ever done. Its gaze haunted me, lingering in the corners of my mind, never letting me forget that it was out there, watching. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this cursed place behind before it swallowed me whole. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I wasn't sure what had driven me back to the forest, to the ravine. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was some misguided sense of duty as a park ranger to protect the land I had sworn to safeguard. But whatever it was, I had gone too far, and now there was no going back. I knew I couldn't stay here. The place felt wrong. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something oppressive and ancient that seemed to seep from the very soil beneath my feet. So I packed up my things. I couldn't bring myself to take the road I had come in on. The forest felt like a living entity, and I was sure that if I took that path again, it would lead me straight back to whatever dark force resided there. So I gathered what little I had left my gear, my essentials, and I headed out in the opposite direction, hoping to find some way to escape. But even as I walked, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me. The trees seemed to stretch higher and higher, their twisted branches blocking out the light, as though trying to keep me in. The sound of the wind in the leaves was gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I didn't dare look back, knowing that if I did, I would see that damn light again. I could already feel it, the pull of the forest, the call to return to it. I walked for hours, not daring to stop or rest. My body ached, but I kept pushing myself forward, driven by the need to get away. I didn't know how much time had passed or how far I had gone, but by the time the first rays of daylight broke through the trees, I knew I had to have been miles from the cabin. I stumbled onto the outskirts of the park, the familiar sight of the ranger station greeting me like a long-lost friend. But even as I approached, a strange sense of unease settled over me. The station was dark. The windows were blacked out, the door ajar, as though no one had been there in days. My heart raced, but I forced myself to enter. Inside, everything was in its place, papers scattered across desks, equipment neatly stacked in the corner, but it was empty. There was no sign of anyone. No one had been there for a while. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what this meant. The park was abandoned. Something had happened, and I wasn't the only one who had felt its pull. The people who worked here, my colleagues, my friends, had vanished, and from the looks of things, they had left in a hurry. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of violence, but they had gone, and whatever was in the woods had driven them away. I didn't know what to do. The park was no longer the place I had once loved. It was a place of fear and darkness, a place that had been twisted by something ancient and malevolent. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished with me. I spent the next few days at the ranger station, trying to piece together what had happened. I combed through the files, looking for any sign of what could have caused this. But there was nothing. No reports, no records, just the same mundane tasks and requests I had dealt with for years. There was no warning, no clue as to what had been brewing in the forest. It was as if everything had been wiped clean. I contacted the authorities, but when they arrived, there was nothing they could do. The forest was still there, but the people who lived and worked within it were gone. No one could explain it. No one could even begin to make sense of what had happened. In the weeks that followed, the park was closed to the public. The land was deemed unsafe, and the ranger station was abandoned. I was reassigned to another area, far from the woods where I had once worked. But the images of that night, the glowing figure, the burning light, the cold eyes stayed with me. I left the area, left the forest behind, but the feeling never truly left me. Every time I saw a shadow in the corner of my vision, every time I heard a whisper in the wind, I couldn't help but wonder, was it still out there? Was it waiting, watching for the next person to cross its path? The answers never came. All I was left with were the questions and the fear that something in those woods would never let go. As time passed, the unsettling memories began to fade, or so I thought. I found myself in new surroundings, working a different post in a quiet corner of the state. The everyday routine of managing a different part of the park brought some relief, and I tried to bury the experiences of that strange, cursed forest deep in my mind. I focused on the mundane tasks of my new role, keeping my mind busy and my hands full. But the fear, that deep, primal fear that had gripped me in the forest, never really left. Years went by, and I convinced myself that it had all been a product of my overactive imagination. That night in the woods, the figures, the glowing lights, it all felt like a nightmare that I had somehow survived. I told myself that I had left the darkness behind me, that I was safe now. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone and the world felt too still, something always pulled at the edges of my thoughts. It was an annoying feeling, like a distant memory trying to resurface, something I wasn't meant to forget. I still couldn't shake the image of that figure, those eyes, cold and knowing, as if they saw right through me. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the image of that forest, of the power it held. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, I received a letter. It was from a Park Service colleague I had worked with before, a ranger who had been stationed at the edge of the forest I had left behind. The letter was simple, but its contents left me unsettled. It described strange events happening once again within the boundaries of the park. Reports of missing hikers, unexplained phenomena, and eerie lights in the same ravine where I had seen the figure all those years ago. I read the letter over and over, the words sinking deep into my chest, suffocating me. It felt like a call, a warning, or perhaps something more. I had to know if the darkness that haunted me all those years ago was still there. Could I really ignore it, turn away as if it had never happened? Or was I being drawn back, just as the others before me had been? The truth hit me hard that night, with a suddenness that took my breath away. There was no escaping it. I would never be free of what I had witnessed. The forest, that dark place, had imprinted itself on me. It had marked me as one of its own, a part of its twisted story that no one could escape. I had spent so much of my life trying to move on, trying to pretend that I hadn't experienced something unexplainable, something far beyond the natural world. But that letter, those words, reminded me that the forest had never really let me go. It was still out there, waiting for the next person to cross its path, to be consumed by its ancient, invisible power. I considered reaching out to others, maybe warning the newcomers, the ones who still believed the forest was just a patch of wilderness, untouched and untroubled. But I knew that I couldn't. No one would listen to me. How could I explain something that defied logic, that couldn't be explained by science or reason? How could I make them understand that the forest wasn't just a place, but a living entity with a consciousness of its own? What had happened to me was a warning. It was a reminder that there are places in this world where the rules of nature don't apply, where the boundary between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown, is so thin it can barely be noticed. I had learned that lesson the hard way, and now all I could do was carry the knowledge with me, a burden I would never be able to fully lay down. The forest remains untouched by time, just as it has always been. It waits, quietly, patiently, for the next wanderer who may unknowingly step into its grasp. I left the forest behind, but I'll never be free of it. I carry it with me, a silent companion in the corners of my mind. Perhaps that's the true horror of it all. Not the figure in the ravine, not the lights or the pain, but the knowledge that no matter where I go, the forest will always be there. A part of me, a part of the land. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for me to return. Or waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. I never went back. I couldn't. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. Because I knew, deep down, that I would never truly escape it. The forest owns a piece of me now. And I can only hope it won't claim more. With that, I closed the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it back in its envelope. The air in the room felt thick, the weight of the past settling heavily around me. There was nothing more I could do now. Nothing more I could say. The story was over for me, but not for the forest. And in the quiet stillness of the night, as I stood up and walked toward the window, I couldn't help but feel the same cold, oppressive silence that had haunted me all those years ago, as though the forest was still watching, still waiting,